motion for debate, the impact of the government's climate agenda. Lord Lilley.
My Lords, it's a great and somewhat unexpected privilege to open this debate, and I particularly look forward to the maiden speech of my noble friend, the Baroness May of Maidenhead. It's fitting that she should make her first contribution to this debate, since the net zero commitment is very much her personal legacy. And it also gives me the chance to thank her for what she and your lordships may feel was a less wise part of her legacy, which was nominating me to this House. It's hard to overstate how crucial cheap energy is for economic growth and prosperity. The quadrupling of oil prices in 1974 ended 3 decades of rapid growth in Western economies. Energy price rises have invariably been followed by a slowdown in growth. On the other hand, thanks to shale oil and gas in America, that country's had cheaper energy and grown faster than other Western economies. And China has fueled extraordinary growth on cheap coal. But let's start with a few facts about climate change, the climate agenda impacts. First, Britain has reduced its territorial emissions of CO2 more than any other major economy, and they're now back to the level they were in 1879. Second, Britain has more offshore wind power than any other country bar China, not to mention its onshore wind, solar and bioenergy. Third, despite or because of this, British industry pays the highest electricity prices in Europe. They doubled in real terms over the 2 decades up to the start of the Ukraine war, even though real gas prices remained largely unchanged over that period. Fourth, we've already lost most of our aluminium industry and are losing our primary steel-making capacity, and with it thousands of jobs, seeing the Grangemouth refinery turning into an import terminal and other British refineries under threat, and we import an increasing proportion of energy-intensive goods like cement and bricks. Fifth, when our manufacturing industry moves abroad, it doesn't reduce global emissions at all. Far from it. We now import many carbon-intensive products, so the reduction in Britain's carbon footprint is only down by 36%, much less than the near halving of our reported territorial emissions. Finally, the government proposed to accelerate the move to net zero, regardless of cost, to prevent new North Sea exploration, instead importing oil and gas, and to ignore or deny the impact this will have on our energy costs, growth and jobs. My Lord, this is an unusually significant debate. As far as I can tell, it's the first time Parliament has formally debated the impact on jobs, growth and prosperity of our decision to decarbonise our economy. Our failure to do so has been part of a collective institutional failure by governments of all parties, both Houses of Parliament, the BBC, the Climate Change Committee and other public bodies to permit or promote an informed debate on the economic costs and benefits of net zero. Costs were never discussed during the passage of the Climate Change Act in 2008, nor during the 90-minute debate committing us to net zero in 2019. It's extraordinary that we still have no official cost-benefit analysis of net zero 5 years after embarking on the project. Our national broadcaster formally decided long ago not to give airtime to any views which might undermine public support for net zero. I discovered this when expressing doubts not about the science of global warming, which is rock solid, but its scale and impact. The BBC published an apology, and I quote, for giving voice to Peter Lilley, removed the offending programme from the BBC iPlayer, lest other people hear my voice, sent the producers on a re-education course and banished me from their studios on this issue ever since. Now, my absence is no great loss to me or the nation, but our national broadcaster's refusal to allow serious debate on the costs of the most expensive commitment since the welfare state is a travesty. The most egregious failure has been that of the Climate Change Committee, which should have provided unbiased estimates of costs for public debate, and I'm glad my noble friend Lord Deben will be able to explain why they refused to do so, even spending large sums of taxpayers' money resisting a freedom of information request for details of their forecasts that net zero would cost the nation 1 to 2% of GDP by 2050. Many assumed that this was the cost of getting to net zero, but actually this was the cost we will face after 2050 once we've eliminated our emissions. The CCC hasn't calculated the cost of getting there. Maybe its forecasting instrument is like one of those telescopes which can focus with great clarity on distant objects, but render anything near at hand a blurred and fuzzy image. Anyway, there seems to be no other reason for exposing this, for not giving us the costs of getting to 2050. The CCC's reluctance to publish its workings was perhaps understandable, given that they were so optimistic. But as it turns out, that is true of those estimates produced by most public bodies. Sir Chris Llewellyn, the lead author of the Royal Society's report on the cost of large-scale electricity storage, recently pointed out that all official estimates are grossly optimistic, and that, he was honest enough, included his own by the Royal Society. So it is sad that we do not have the information on which we can have an honest and informed debate. Now, true believers in net zero are reluctant to discuss its costs because they've convinced themselves that there aren't any. It will give us cheap energy and boost growth by creating new jobs in new industries, exporting clean technologies worldwide, making the world greener and ourselves richer. How wonderful if that were true. My lords, there's an old saying that if something seems too good to be true, it probably isn't true. I hope that wind power in particular, because we've got lots of it, will one day be cheaper than fossil fuels. But it patently isn't yet. If wind and solar were cheaper, why have our electricity prices doubled as they replaced fossil fuels? If renewables are cheaper, why is our electricity more expensive than other European countries who have less than us? If renewables are cheaper, why do they need subsidy? Apologists say, but those are the costs of old technologies. The costs are coming down. The first part is true. A shame they didn't tell us at the time, because Dieter Helm has calculated that Britain wasted up to £100 billion by investing prematurely in immature technology, rather than waiting until it was cost-effective. But the Secretary of State assured us last month that on the basis of recent auctions, renewables are the cheapest form of power to build and operate. Unfortunately, that's simply not true. The latest auction price for offshore wind was £82 per megawatt hour in today's money, whereas his own department's figures, for reference, that's page 24 on the electricity generating cost document, put the cost to build and operate a new gas plant at less than £60 per megawatt hour. Does the Secretary of State repudiate his own departmental figures? Moreover, this is only half the story, because they're not comparing like with like. Wind is intermittent, and Dieter Helm again advised government that to make a true comparison, costs of wind should include the cost of backup generators or storage. Electricity which isn't there when you want it is less valuable than electricity which is. My economics lecturer taught us this by the old fable of the two New York bakers. One advertised bagels at 50 cents each, the other opposite him at $1 each. A customer went to the cheaper baker and asked for a bagel. Sorry, we're out of bagels, he was told. So he went to the other store and asked if they got any bagels. When the shopkeeper gave him one and charged him $1, he protested, but the shop opposite only charges 50 cents a bagel. Well, why didn't you go there? I did, but he's out of bagels just now. To which the other shopkeeper replied, when I'm out of bagels, I only charge 50 cents. Well, wind may be as cheap as other things when it's available, but it's a lot more expensive when it isn't. The electricity is, when it isn't there, when you want it, is less valuable than electricity is. So you need backup gas plants or storage, and backup gas plants are doubly expensive because they can only operate when the wind isn't blowing. And they in turn need carbon capture and storage, which, even if it can be made to work with gas-fired stations, which it hasn't yet, will add further costs, again doubly so because it will only operate part-time. Now, the second leg of the too good to be true story is that if we plough ahead with decarbonising our economy supply, we will enrich ourselves by generating new export industries. The Industry Minister, the noble Lord Vallance, who pursued the Sue Gray route to the upper echelons of the Labour Party, was given a little section of his own in the Labour manifesto in which he said, by accelerating the transition to clean homegrown energy, we will not only end the era of high energy bills, but will be helping ourselves and exporting our solutions worldwide. But if we choose to go slowly, others will provide the answers and ultimately we'll end up buying these solutions rather than selling them. Where's he been for the last 20 years? Far from choosing to go slowly, we've outpaced other countries, but we've had to buy the solutions from abroad. Imports of renewable technologies vastly exceed our exports. Foreign suppliers have finally begun to make wind vanes and assemble generators in this country, which is welcome, but they're largely for our fields, and those companies are not going to make us an export hub. The only turbines we export are gas turbines, which we are phasing out and urging others to do likewise. The only area where we might take the lead in developing a new industry is small nuclear, which I persuaded the Energy and Climate Change Committee to back a decade ago. I hope this government will give that project more welly than my government did. My Lords, an honest appraisal of the costs of net zero will conclude that it's bound to be costly. That doesn't necessarily mean we should abandon it. If the costs are less than the likely benefits to the world in reducing the impacts of global warming, it's worth the world bearing those costs. Britain's contribution to global emissions, of course, is very small, less than 1%, so our impact alone is negligible. But of course, I accept we must be prepared to make our proportionate contribution to that collective effort. I know many noble lords believe we should go further, that we should lead the world by going further and faster in that direction. Yeah. In this case, slower. I confess, I've always found the idea that we can lead the world somewhat hubristic, a hangover from our imperial past. So far, the big emitters, China, India, and in future, Africa and Latin America, have made it clear they don't give a damn what we do. But the one thing we can be sure of is if we impose such costs on our economy that we self-harm and reduce our emissions by exporting our industry abroad, other countries will take note and learn the lessons from our folly and make sure they don't follow our lead. I hope that we can now have an honest, frank, well-informed debate comparing the costs of action with the benefits of action. And I'm sure that will be a point my bishop will be making due course, since we may not agree on this issue, but we do agree on the importance of honesty. We can only have an honest debate if it's well informed and if we stop trying to convince ourselves that fairy tales are true.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
I welcome this debate and I look forward to other speakers and the debate that will take place between them, and in particular I look forward to the maiden speech by the noble lady Baroness May of Maidenhead. Now, I'm not pursuing the points which are being made specifically in the introduction. I'm using the limited time available to me to highlight some important work which has been undertaken on climate change, excellent work which has been undertaken on climate change by the actuarial profession. And in doing so, I must declare my interest as a member of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries as entered in the register. Now, climate change is an issue to which actuaries are devoting increasing attention. What happens in the future is, of course, intrinsic to the work of actuaries, and hence the risks inherent in climate change are an essential element in the work that we do. It's already built into our professional standards. We are, in an important sense, risk scientists, able to uncover uncomfortable possibilities involving the risks we face, to which mainstream debates struggle to give sufficient weight. I don't really have enough time to go through the entire arguments, but I trust my noble friend, the Minister, will follow up the information and perhaps even organise a meeting at which they can be explored at greater length. But in summary, past work undertaken by the profession in the report they produced last year, entitled Emperor's New Climate Scenarios, A Warning for Financial Services, identified first that the models, many of the models used to predict economic damage for the hothouse world we face have been too optimistic. The actuaries are saying the models are not sufficiently accurate upon which we can place sufficient weight. They underestimate the rate at which the Earth is warming, and hence the carbon budgets which are based on those estimates are no longer applicable. Now, more recent work by the profession has identified how close we are to the risk of real problems and how they should be taken into account when making our decisions on policy. Now, the key document here is the Institute's report from March of this year, written in conjunction with Exeter University, entitled Climate Scorpion, The Sting is in the Tail. The point that's being made here in the title is that the models currently being used fail to adequately take into account what's called the tail risks, the problems that appear towards the end of the period which is being assessed. The risky outcomes of climate change are those in the tail end of the models which are being used. In short, the message is that we need to give greater weight in our assessment to worst-case scenarios. These need to be taken into account when making policy on climate change. This is essential given our growing yet precarious lack of knowledge about extreme climate risk and, crucially, the tipping points, the range of tipping points that we face. For example, we have to treat the 1.5 degrees centigrade limit as a physical limit and not a political target. Too often the long-term impacts of climate change are described in terms of central estimates, when rule number one of risk assessment is to focus on the worst case. This subsequent work by actuaries makes it clear, firstly, that current energy policies are not sufficient to meet the Paris Agreement goals, and that an overshoot of the 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold is now more likely than in the past, and the rate of global warming has been accelerating in 2023. In fact, the rate of acceleration was accelerating. We're going faster towards these tipping point risks. Secondly, there are material risks associated with a failure to meet these goals, with the risk of triggering multiple climate tipping points and a potential tipping cascade. We must understand that a failure to meet the target doesn't mean that things will be a little bit worse. What we must take more seriously is that when we pass one of these tipping points, the result is catastrophe. I have to say, therefore, that I do have some concern about the reply my noble friend the Minister gave to Baroness Jones of Musilcom's written question yesterday, referring to AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. At school, maybe we referred to the Gulf Stream Drift. It's now AMOC. The collapse of AMOC undoubtedly presents existential risks, overused word, but in this case it's meaningful, risk to food production and water availability. Saying it's okay so far, and there's a range of views, is not an adequate response to the risks that we face. So to conclude, the actuarial profession is taking these risks seriously. Their reports are by practitioners who understand the nature of risks and how you adapt policy to risks. And I very much hope the government will be able to accept the information that they're being provided and adapt the policies to reflect these new dangers.
My Lords, I refer the House to my interests as set out in the register, specifically my chairmanship of Beyond Net Zero, of Carbon Place and of the Board of Aquatic, and my membership of the Board of the Institute of Carbon Management at the University of California. I also refer the noble Lords to my co-chairmanship of the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology. I very much look forward to the hearing from the noble lady Baroness May on her remarks in this debate. Meanwhile, I'll make 4 short points. First, targeted investment in net zero will encourage rather than hinder economic growth, and for that reason it's worth pursuing. The market opportunities are sizable, and importantly, the UK labour market possesses the relevant skills to grow climate-related activity at scale. We're fortunate to have world-class research scientists and academics who are at the cutting edge of climate and energy technologies. Structures like the Faraday Institute, the UK's flagship institute for electrochemical energy research and development, show what is possible when industry partners are involved working together with the innovators on projects with real commercial potential. We probably have 50% of the technologies we need to get to net zero, but we also have universities such as Cambridge that are awash with groups which have the potential to take discovery science, incubate it, and prepare it for the commercial markets, and to get the scale that we need, not just in the UK, but also in the world. And of course, there is a wealth of engineering and technological expertise amongst those who've spent decades working in my old industry, oil and gas, that can now be deployed in the wind, solar, nuclear, and other energy sectors. Secondly, the government's commitment to net zero must be reflected in consistent policy approaches. Whatever the rationale at the time, the previous government's announcement that they would delay banning the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 5 years to 2035 was quite counterproductive. It sent mixed messages to investors, and electric vehicle supply chains were heavily damaged. Supply was disrupted and consumer confidence was suffered. The new government's green energy mission, the establishment of Great British Energy, and the convening of solar and wind task forces are all encouraging, but they cannot simply be strong statements of intent. They must be accompanied by vehicles for focused delivery. For that, the private sector must be invited to the table and provided with the incentives to invest and scale their operations even further. And that brings me to my third point: incentives and private sector investment. Incentives are the result of pricing externalities, something we must tackle head-on if we are to achieve the necessary climate correction. For example, the carbon released by one actor but affecting another must be priced and paid for. Incentives to release less carbon or to avoid emissions altogether then follow. Governments are well placed to introduce incentives of this kind or preferential tax regimes, but they must be accompanied by substantial levels of private investment if the national energy transition is to be delivered and the necessary climate technologies commercialised and, importantly, scaled. Governments can set the regulatory environment to encourage investment, and in some cases they can lean in, providing incentives or concessionary finance, but they cannot be expected to deliver. The UK continues to lead the world as a wellspring of sustainable finance in the form of venture capital, private equity, and large-scale institutional investors. The success of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is a point in case. Fourth, we must now pick up the pace. The direction and quality of investment flow is eminently predictable if the surrounding conditions are known and controlled. This is the story of economic growth in all sectors, perhaps most notably in the extraction and burning of hydrocarbons over centuries past in this country. There's no reason to believe that it won't continue to be true in the story of our new energy and climate revolution. I'm very optimistic, and progress is picking up, but the missing element is time. In my opinion, we are approximately 25 years behind. So we must accelerate the rollout of incentives, financing, and R&D breakthroughs. And I believe that this country is very well placed to do just that.
My Lords, I too would like to thank the noble Lord Lilley for securing this important debate, and also say I'm looking forward very much to the maiden speech of Baroness May, who I know will bring great insight and experience to your Lordship's House. I also declare my interests as President of the Rural Coalition. My Lords, I believe we need to take climate change extremely seriously, and I commend the previous government and indeed some of the plans of this present administration for the steps that they're taking. And I also support the noble Lord Lilley's plea for open and transparent costs of net zero so we can make informed choices. It seems to me that's absolutely fundamental to all that we're doing in every part of our work. It's other noble lords will be able to speak in a more informed way than I can about the positive impact that net zero can have on the economy, not least those jobs in new and emerging sectors such as renewable energy, but also in offsetting the negative economic impacts that climate change bring with it, such as drought, pollution, ill health. I want to limit my comments to quite a focused area, and that is to do with the role of the use of land, and particularly working with our farmers. My Lords, farmers are acutely attuned to changes in weather and therefore to the impact of climate change. They don't have a choice, their whole livelihood depends upon it. Some of the increasingly extreme weather that we've seen over the past recent years, with record rainfall and subsequent flooding, alongside periods of extreme heat, have hit farmers very hard. I outlined to your Lordship's House a few weeks ago the devastation and economic costs that have been dealt to farmers recently in the wake of extreme flooding. May I remind the House that last winter there were parts of the UK which experienced double the level of the monthly rainfall totals of the period that was experienced between 1991 and 2020. Farmers uniquely placed to play an important role as stewards of so much of our land in helping to achieve His Majesty's Government's climate change agenda through nature recovery, sustainable food production and clean energy supply. There's a real opportunity here to have our agricultural industry set a leading example of how economic growth, food security and new energy technologies can work together as a force for good in responding to the environmental challenges we face. I urge the noble Lord the Minister to ensure that farmers are treated as crucial partners in pursuing the climate change agenda, that they're listened to and supported as the burden and demands that are made on them continue to increase. My Lords, in one of the counties in which I'm privileged to serve, Hertfordshire, we have some of the most innovative, forward-looking farmers in the whole world. They're right at the cutting edge of how we're going to face the challenges of food production, food security, but also net zero. What they're asking for, of course, is a level playing field in the international markets. And as any future trade agreements are brokered, they're concerned that they are not disadvantaged in any way. In light of the urgent need to safeguard our environment and to make the government's aims for food security, energy security and net zero a reality, the government must provide a renewed and improved annual agricultural budget of at least £4 billion a year, which is what the NFU has been calling for, so that they can play their part in what's required. British farmers already own or host about 70% of the UK's total solar generation capacity, whether on rooftops of farm buildings or in solar farms. Many food producers also host on-farm wind power. They have a clear role to play in the government's commitment to making the UK a clean energy superpower, but it's important that this is balanced with protecting the best agricultural land for food production. My Lords, it was only a couple of years ago we saw the invasion of Ukraine having an immediate impact on cost of food, cost of fertilisers, and really impacting upon us. Food security is not some optional thing, it's absolutely fundamental to us as a nation. Whilst rooftop installations offer an ideal platform for renewables, I urge the government to ensure that these are prioritised along with brownfield sites to mount solar farms rather than using the most productive agricultural land, which we must protect for our food production. I would like to seek assurances from the Minister that he will do all he can on this front to ensure that these principles are enshrined in the forthcoming land use framework.
My Lords, I very much welcome this speech and congratulate my noble friend Lord Lilley for calling this debate, because climate change is a challenge that we do need to face, especially for those of us who believe in an open, free market economy and have to accept that historically our free, open economies have often operated without properly acknowledging the external costs created by the energy that we were using, exactly as the noble Lord Browne said. We need to move to honest prices, fully reflecting the costs of carbon emissions as part of a belief in a functioning market economy. And if we go through this process, we will end up with a system with enormous benefits, with greater security of supply, with much less exposure to the risks of volatile gas prices, and indeed, in many cases, lower operational costs, particularly for people driving motor vehicles. The costs of adjustment are indeed high, and we absolutely need rigorous economic analysis of what those costs are and who bears those costs. And at Resolution, and I should declare an interest as President of the Resolution Foundation, we absolutely try to apply economic analysis to those costs. I'm delighted that this is a speech where we will be, a debate where we will be hearing the maiden speech of the noble Baroness May of Maidenhead. Of course, one reason is that she took a lead in committing Britain to a net zero target. But if I may say so, there's a second reason as well, which is she also took a lead in focusing on living standards of people just about managing, people who are struggling to make ends meet. She reminded us that care about and concern about those living standards should be a cross-party issue and not the prerogative of any one party. And this debate is an opportunity to combine our concern about the challenge of climate change with also recognition that the cost of adjustment must be borne fairly. Some of these issues are most acute in the transport sector, which I would like to touch on in particular. This is not an area where we have made massive progress. Transport emissions of carbon dioxide are now greater than they were in 1990. The problem is getting worse, not getting better. A large part of these emissions are associated with car use. Over 80% of journeys are still taken by motorcar. But it's also where the gains from successful adjustment are massive. hundreds of billions of pounds of savings when we move to fundamentally lower cost electric vehicles powered by clean energy. But at the moment, the costs of buying these electric vehicles are still too high, whilst the benefits, once you've got one, can be very low. I'll be very interested to hear from the Minister what their plans are to improve the regime for electric vehicles. For a start, if you are able to charge your electric vehicle at home, in a private driveway or whatever, the costs of charging are only half the costs faced by less affluent people who are having to charge their cars on the street. This gap in pricing is a major problem. We need to improve the planning regime so that on-street charging becomes cheaper and quicker. We need greater competition, and I hope the Minister will be able to tell us what plans the government has to narrow the gap between the costs of on-street and off-street charging, which is now very substantial. We have historically been rewarding the purchase of electric cars with a very favourable tax regime. These benefits have largely gone to affluent people buying electric cars. That's where innovation starts. They were initially very high cost. It was understandable that the driver of the change would come from the people who could afford expensive electric vehicles. But as the costs fall, will the government accept that it is no longer necessary to have such expensive subsidies and rewards for the cost of buying an electric vehicle, and will instead put more support into holding down the costs for people charging them? Very briefly, my lords, another area of transport where we face very serious challenges is flying. The growth of emissions from jet flight means that we will soon be seeing them as the biggest single contributor to carbon emissions in the transport sector. And I think there is another uncomfortable fact about the distribution of the costs of adjusting to climate change and the inability at the moment fully to cover those costs. It's very likely that the emissions simply from jet travel from the most affluent 20% of people in this country, those emissions will be greater than the total emissions from heating their house, from transport, from any other costs incurred by the least affluent 20%. Yet jet travel is an area where we are still not properly covering the costs of the carbon that we are emitted. Isn't that an area for radical progress? I think at the end of the day, we will end up, and the economic analysis, I have to say, is pretty compelling on this, we will end up with fantastic opportunities for Britain, not because of fantasies about being world-leading, and certainly not by ignoring the economic costs, but by investing in technologies, investing in our natural advantages with wind and offshore power and tidal power, and indeed small modular reactors. At the end of the day, we can have a more efficient economy and a more equitable one as well.
My Lords, it is a huge privilege to be standing here in this place to make my maiden speech. And in doing so, I would refer your Lordships to my entry in the Register of Interests, in particular my chairmanship of the Aldersgate Group, a not-for-profit which deals with climate change and environment matters, and my chairmanship of the Global Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking. I stand here feeling the privilege of being in this place, but also with a sense of trepidation. People outside of this House have said to me, "Oh, don't worry, you were a Member of Parliament for Maidenhead for 27 years. It'll be all right, you'll know what the ropes are, you'll know the rules." And I say, no, this is a very different place. And when they say how, I say, well, for a start, their Lordships normally only speak when they know what they're talking about. I will endeavour, my Lords, to follow that rule in my contributions in this place. I would like to thank all of those who have welcomed me and eased my transition. The staff of the House, the Black Rod and her staff, the doorkeepers, the clerks, the Lord Speaker's office, the catering department, who provided a wonderful lunch after my introduction, the security and other people who have helped me and guided me when they have found me wandering aimlessly along a corridor. I would also like to thank my two supporters on my introduction, my noble friends, the Lord True and the Baroness Evans of Bowes Park. And I would like to thank my mentor, my noble friend, the Baroness Goldie. I hope she won't mind if I tell the story of the day of my introduction, when I was standing in the Moses room with my supporters, waiting to process into the chamber, and my noble friend turned up with a very large envelope for me. And my supporters indicated how generous it was of her to give me a gift. And she said, "It's the companion on standing orders. To read during recess." I have not yet been tested on it, but I would like to thank my noble friend for the help and support that she has given me, not just recently, but over many years. It is a great pleasure to be speaking in a debate on climate change, and I thank my noble friend, the Lord Lilley, for initiating this debate. But I recognise there may be some differences of opinion across the House on this particular issue. Myself, I view with deep concern changes in our climate recently. 2023 was the hottest year in human history. Without action, we will see the frequency and severity of extreme weather events accelerating. The Amazon rainforest will become a carbon source, not a carbon sink. And some of those countries currently sitting around the Commonwealth Heads of Government table will simply cease to exist. But I believe there is good news, that we can reap economic benefit from dealing with climate change. The Net Zero Review of 2023 indicated that dealing with the transition from fossil fuels to sustainability was the growth opportunity of the 21st century, estimating that we could see nearly 500,000 new green jobs here in the UK by 2030. And McKinsey's have estimated that dealing with providing goods and services for the global net zero transition could bring £1 trillion sterling to the UK economy by 2030. And I also believe there is a cost of inaction. Yes, as the Green Finance Institute have said, as just one example, they have estimated that the degradation of our environment linked to climate could lead to a loss of 12% of our GDP. But I also think that if we just look at this debate as a matter of who has the biggest sterling figure on their side of the argument, we are missing something, because there is a real human cost to climate change. When extreme weather destroys homes and livelihoods, when harvests fail, when water supply dries up, then people are driven to destitution and desperation. And in that destitution and desperation lies vulnerability, and particularly vulnerability to modern slavery and human trafficking. If the agriculture in a community fails year on year, then parents are more likely to take the difficult, heartbreaking decision to let their sons and daughters move or be taken away to the promise of a better life, but in fact to be taken into slavery, forced into work from which they cannot escape, their freedom and human dignity cruelly taken from them. So I believe that that is an issue that we simply cannot and must not ignore. So in looking at climate change, in dealing with climate change, I believe there is an economic benefit. It can bring jobs and prosperity, but it can also help us reduce vulnerability to modern slavery and human trafficking. And so I would urge the government and all across this House to recognise the need to deal with climate change, to save our planet and to save our humanity.
My Lords, it's a pleasure to be the first to commend the moving and compelling speech of my noble friend and indeed of my former Member of Parliament. And how appropriate that it should be made on the subject of climate change, whereas we've heard my noble friend ensured her legacy by making the UK the first major economy to enshrine in law a net zero carbon target. But she also accelerated progress internationally, cementing our credentials as an ambitious and reliable climate change partner. My noble friend is particularly welcome in your Lordship's house because, as Prime Minister, she responded to the Burns Committee report by exercising restraint in new appointments, unlike the generosity of her immediate successor. My Lords, our paths first crossed nearly 30 years ago when Maidenhead Conservatives were choosing a new candidate. My seat in London had been abolished, and I fancied my prospects in this newly created constituency. My family had lived in it for over 200 years. My wife had been on the local council, my children had been to the local comprehensive, and I was in the cabinet. The selection committee threw me out in the first round and chose instead an unknown councillor from Merton. And a great local MP my noble friend became, dominating the pages of the Maidenhead Advertiser every Friday and surprising constituents between elections by knocking on their doors on a Saturday morning, asking what they thought of the train service into Paddington. And she did that even when she was Prime Minister. No cause was too small to generate her support, literally, as when she came to Cookham last year to celebrate the return of the water vole to the banks of the River Thames. My noble friend was on the front bench from 2001, becoming the longest-serving Home Secretary for 60 years, and then becoming leader and Prime Minister in 2016, without the necessity of asking party members, not the most reliable of electorates. She generously invited me to join her administration and retained my services throughout, unlike her predecessor, who sacked me not once, but twice. My noble friend led the country with patience at a time of maximum turbulence in her party at the other end, who treated her badly. In retrospect, Parliament should have backed her proposals on Brexit, as the country would have had a better deal than the one we ended up with. Along with the net zero commitments, my noble friend will be remembered for the Modern Slavery Act, and she's pursuing that cause by leading the Global Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking, focusing on the impact of climate change on population movement. Throughout her public life, my noble friend has demonstrated decency, integrity, courage, and selflessness. Before we heard of the known principles, she embodied them. In her book, The Abuse of Power, my noble friend poses this question: does politics attract people who yearn for power rather than for the opportunity to serve? For my noble friend, there is no shadow of doubt about the answer. We warmly welcome her to the House, and we look forward to her future contributions. Turning to my noble friend's motion, I just want to make one point, as I've used most of my available time. My noble friend invites us to take note of the impact of the government's climate agenda on growth, jobs and prosperity. But my noble friend is choosing his own criteria. Without pressing the analogy too closely, but just to make a point, what would have been the reaction of your lordships if 80 years ago, in 1944, my noble friend had asked what was the impact on jobs, growth and prosperity of World War II? And the answer then would have been that while these issues were important, there was an overriding priority. Now, of course, climate change is not about saving freedom and democracy, but the Prime Minister and others, indeed in this debate, have described it as an existential threat. So it follows that steps taken to avoid that threat would push the criteria my noble friend has chosen down the agenda. And to that extent, they are, of course, important, but secondary. And the primary question should be, how effective is the government's agenda in averting climate change? Now, my noble friend may not accept there is an existential threat, and others will argue this case better than I can. But my view is that we are approaching a number of tipping points which would adversely affect the world in which we live, with consequences for the air we breathe, for global warming, rising sea levels, droughts, mass migration, and the rest. And so, my lords, forced to choose between my two noble friends, Lord Lilley and Baroness May, Baroness May once again has my vote.
Well done, George. Brilliant.
My Lords, I thank my noble friend Lord Lilley for securing this important debate and for his insightful introduction. Climate change is real and a living reality for many across the globe. Indeed, for some small island nations, it remains an existential threat and it impacts growth and prosperity. In welcoming my noble friend Baroness May to her place, as we've already heard from the noble Lord Young, she brings incredible insights and a deep sense of devotion to public service. And during her tenure as Prime Minister, she championed tackling climate change and was a powerful advocate of collective action on the world stage. To coin a phrase, we are all in it together. My noble friend Lord Lilley talked of my noble friend's decision to appoint him to this House, and I assure my noble friend, perhaps like others, we love hearing his voice, and I agree with his call for transparency of costs, for enabling those long-term decisions, both at home and internationally. And as far as appointments are concerned, a moment of personal reflection in relation to my noble friend, Lady May. The noble Lord Young talked of her selection as Maidenhead. She left a vacancy in Merton. I followed in her shoes, minus the heels, of course, although perhaps standing at 5'6", I would have benefited greatly from those. But nevertheless, she was an advocate for localism, and it was an honour to follow her. Indeed, it was the noble lady who introduced me to the Conservative Party, and indeed it was the noble lady who appointed me as Minister of State at the Foreign Office. That turned out to be a long-term decision. But when I was appointed to the Foreign Office, one of my early visits, I recall, was to the Caribbean. I was actually in the Pacific Island Forum in Australasia, in Fiji. Hurricanes hit the Caribbean. There was a moment of trepidation. I needed to invoke, very early on in my career at the Foreign Office, that call, the call to the boss, about alerting the Prime Minister to what had happened in the Caribbean. The noble lady acted promptly, convened a COBRA, and with others I was dispatched to the region. What I saw was nothing short of devastation. It was like a war scene. And it instilled in me the need to tackle climate change collectively and the need for international action. What I saw firsthand was physical devastation and the economic impact on both independent nations as well as our own overseas territories. In Antigua and Barbuda, the country's entire GDP was wiped out by Mother Nature and the ravages of the hurricanes. It brought into focus the importance of climate finance, which I want to focus on, and the need to update processes and dated bureaucratic procedures, which hindered countries' abilities, particularly those who had graduated to middle-income status, who yet through a single event, through no fault of their own, would see their economic infrastructure wiped out. And I do hope, as I look towards the Minister, that the government continues to advocate for reforms in these international structures. They need reform and they need it urgently, as well as championing the importance of small island developing states to access funds, and more pointedly, the issue of access must be addressed. Much work needs to be done in supporting technical support for these countries. We have already, as a country, signed up to internationally agreed targets, limiting our own emissions, and indeed we've delivered upon these as well. But the UK has also stood up and committed to providing financial support to developing countries in the form of international climate finance. In 2009, the UK, together with other developed countries, committed to providing $100 billion in climate finance annually by 2020. And this would be provided by both the public and private sectors. And in 2019, I recall announcing a commitment on behalf of the United Kingdom of £11.6 billion during the UN High-Level Week. a commitment to be made from the years 2021 to 26 in support of this international target. And yes, the UK was rightly recognised as an international leader on this important priority. Can the Noble Lord, the Minister, please confirm that the Labour government will continue to uphold our international commitments? Also, the previous government committed to investing directly in both adaptation and mitigation, and doing so committed to spend $3 billion on nature. Indeed, this was a priority of the COP we hosted in Glasgow. The direct benefits are clear. Again, when you travel around the globe, you see how climate change impacts, but also the results of taking action. When I visited Bangladesh, I saw nature-based solutions through the replanting of mangroves have a major and powerful result on not just mitigation from typhoons, but it saved lives. And as my noble friend highlighted, it also, through action, saves livelihoods. At the COP26, we introduced the Global Forest Finance Pledge, and I hope the government will continue to champion this, particularly as CHOGM is convened this week with our Commonwealth family of nations. Therefore, I ask the Minister again, can he confirm that the government remains committed to upholding existing commitments? And I was somewhat puzzled, and perhaps the Noble Lord, the Minister, can clarify how the commitment that the previous government has made on climate finance can be squared off with the Foreign Secretary's recent statement that the ICF would be subject to a planned spending review. The issue of the UK's green finance strategy, where the private sector is being mobilised, is also an important priority, and I hope the government will continue to focus on the strong relationship, the cooperation between governments and the private sector, as we heard from the Noble Lord Browne. I look forward to the Minister's reply.
My Lords, first may I remind the House of my declaration of interest, particularly as the former chairman of the Climate Change Committee. And may I particularly welcome the maiden speech of my noble friend, who for me, by talking about one nation and handing on to the next generation something better than we have ourselves received, sums up why I'm a Conservative. And only when the Conservative Party follows those views are we actually Conservative. I'd also like to thank Lord Lilley for being able to produce this debate. He is a very old friend, so he won't mind me reminding a bit about his past. When Margaret Thatcher was off in the United Nations pleading for international action against climate change, he was telling his colleagues in the cabinet that he didn't really accept the arguments about climate change or global warming.
Completely untrue. You're making it up.
Statistically, well, I remember the conversation. He said, I'm a statistician and the statistics don't prove this. But it's perfectly true that he now believes it's rock solid. But he doesn't accept that if it is rock solid, we have to do everything about it because it threatens us all. And his speech could be made in any parliament in the whole of the world, getting up to say, very serious climate change, but not for us, because we've got to do this and that and the other. It's rather bad for our economy, so we won't do it. Every country could do that. His policy is the after you, Claude policy. When other people do it, then we do it. That seems to me to be dishonourable. You cannot put that forward. If you believe in climate change and you see it as an existential threat, you actually have to act. And I'm proud of a cross-party attitude. All parties have supported this, although my Lord Lilley did not support the Climate Change Act. We have to realise that there is a difference between accepting the fact and being prepared to act on those facts. And action means we do it ourselves first. Because if you don't, as the Right Reverend Bishop's bench will accept, if you don't do it, there is no point in asking people to do as you say. And the effect of Britain doing it has been remarkable. If I look back to the first days as chairman of the Climate Change Committee, I do have to say I didn't expect we'd ever get to the decision in Paris. Nor would have I accepted from Boris Johnson, whose leadership was not my favourite one, I wouldn't have expected the remarkable steps forward which we had at Glasgow. But the result of that is that nations throughout the world have signed up to net zero, and nations throughout the world have begun to ratchet up what they are doing. And that is why we have to get back into leadership, the leadership we lost by the entirely unacceptable things of putting off the date in which we were going to have compulsory electric or equivalent cars, which meant that business, as the noble Lord Browne points out, that business didn't in any way feel the conviction and the certainty which business needs. Now, apart from being a minister for 16 years, I've been a businessman all my life, and I know perfectly well that the most important thing in business is to find out the certainties. And the certainties are clear. The climate change will get worse every year. The cost of not doing something about it gets worse every year. The Climate Change Committee has done a detailed statement about how much it will cost. It will be something around 1% of our gross national product every year. But that's only if we do it. Of course, it builds up. If you don't do it, it costs you more and more. And the cost of inaction is huge. And it is already true. Because people, who shall be nameless, pressed Mr. Cameron, Lord Cameron, as Prime Minister, he rode back on what was called the green rubbish. And what did he do? It meant that every family in Britain has had to spend at least £1,000 more because we had not moved fast enough into renewable energy. Renewable energy on the facts. I do get fed up with people who cherry pick. The facts are quite simple. The basic cost today is £83 a megawatt hour, and we onshore and solar has just been agreed at 68 and offshore at 80, so already it is clearly lower, and that's with the gas not at its highest price. Do we really want to be in the hands of this volatility of the gas price? Do we want to be in the hands of some of the nastiest regimes in the world? Or do we want to have our own energy source at a lower price, at a cost we can afford? The figures are all there. The Climate Change Committee has done it year after year, but I have not noticed Lord Lilley present at any of the presentations, at any of the discussions. So I merely say to him, read the documents again and accept that you are on one side, science, the church, and the Climate Change Committee are on the other.
My Lords, can I begin by thanking my noble friend Lord Lilley for securing today's debate and for his strong support for economic rationality in this area over the years since he voted against the Climate Change Act in 2008. Can I draw Noble Lord's attention to my statement of interest in the Register? I am a trustee of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, one of the few organisations that tried to keep debate alive on this issue, and so it's very good that we have today's debate. Today's debate is a very good sign. I think the net zero consensus is beginning to crumble. In my view, we're not in a climate emergency. Climate change is a challenge we can meet. It isn't one that requires us to upend our entire economy and our way of life. Now, today is supposed to be a debate about the economy, and I want to focus on that. For too long, many people have claimed that net zero is good for growth and prosperity, and we've heard that today. I'm sorry, I believe this is nonsense, and I'm going to show you why today. One of the reasons why I'm confident our current approach is harmful is that it requires many normally sensible people, and perhaps some who aren't quite so sensible, to have to believe in a whole series of fallacies, economic fallacies, for their policy to work. And I'll just briefly set some of these out. First of all, the broken window fallacy. We're supposed to believe in the Skidmore report that net zero will make us richer. Well, of course, spending trillions on a new energy system has some economic spin-offs, and it does get you an asset. Just like repairing a broken window funds the glazier and gets you a window back. But your wealth is just the same. And in fact, what we're doing today is creating an actual reduction in wealth. The new asset is actually worse than the old one. The replacement of the current grid with rickety and expensive renewables is not an improvement. It's a massive reduction in productive capacity, malinvestment of the worst kind. Just think of all the genuinely productive projects that could be funded with the trillions we're going to spend over the year. How much real wealth could have been created? Second fallacy, the fallacy of it's all going to be all right on the night. This is a belief that one day we will just solve the problems. We'll solve the storage problem with hydrogen, hydro, batteries, whatever. The view that interconnects will always work well. They'll never export when they're supposed to import. Those to whom we are connected will never think their interests come first. I can tell you I learned from the vaccines saga and France's threats to Jersey in 2021 that you can't rely even on our closest friends when the chips are down. This policy is making us deeply insecure. Third fallacy, the fallacy of self-deception, most obviously on prices and costs. In the real world, I'm sorry, renewables are simply not getting cheaper, and some are eye-wateringly expensive. The existing CFD-funded offshore wind farms have cost over £150 per megawatt hour in current prices this financial year so far. The new projects awarded in AR6 are going to cost over 80 per megawatt hour, when, as my noble friend Lord Lilley has pointed out, the market price is around 60. And those figures for renewables ignore the subsidy. They ignore the need for backup and storage. A child can see, surely, that it isn't cheaper to build a renewables grid plus all the backup than just to build effective backup and forget about the renewables. Fourth fallacy, the fallacy that jobs are a benefit, not a cost. Net zero proponents paint this glowing picture of hundreds of thousands of new green jobs. But if the energy system requires many more people than now, how is that making the country more productive? If you believe that, you must think we could make ourselves wealthier by sending everyone back into the fields to work on the land. We want the fewest, the most highly productive jobs possible, like those we already have in the oil and gas industry, but jobs which this government is gradually extinguishing. Fifth fallacy, the fallacy of the infinite availability of resources. In this world, in the net zero world, there's always lots of capital waiting to be used. We always have enough workers. There are no linkages or timing problems for proper sequencing. Foreigners are always willing to lend to the UK. UK consumers are always happy to save instead of consume. Massive projects, such as insulating every home in the UK or doubling the capacity of the energy grid, can be undertaken apparently without any resource constraints or knock-on effects in the wider economy. To put it charitably, that's not a realistic depiction of the world in which we live. And finally, my lords, there's the industrial policy fallacy. The view that the government knows best, that it can pick the technologies, the subsidies and the targets to get us to net zero. The ineffective boilers and heat pumps, the expensive EVs, the windmills, the technology that was last cutting edge in this country under Henry II. I think we can be confident that any project pursued in this way is going to be a drag on the economy. All economic theory tells us so. Now, I believe in the long-standing conservative principles, seemingly so uncertainly held in much of my party nowadays: economic freedom, decentralised decision-taking, incentives for entrepreneurs, economic experimentation. Yet the net zero approach we've chosen is requiring us to junk all this in favour of greater control and restrictions of Soviet-style production targets, policies we believe are wrong in any area except when it comes to net zero. And I urge my colleagues who support net zero on these benches to reflect. If you're a Conservative and your policy forces you to implement socialism, then just maybe it's a bad policy. The truth is, all of this can only have one consequence for the economy, which is to make it less productive and slower growing as it increasingly is. The only way out is to unwind, invest in productive energy, gas and nuclear, and lots of it, stop picking winners, roll back the subsidies and let the market decide. Now, I'd have more sympathy with net zero proponents if, and some have been today, they're honest about this. If they said, this is going to cost you, we've got to do it anyway, then at least it would focus minds and could have a real debate about whether the ends justified the means, not the fantasy debate we're currently in, where everything is for the best and everything would turn out right. On net zero, we need a bit more Hayek and a bit less Candide.
My Lords, I thank the noble Lord Lilley, for securing this debate, even if perhaps it's turned out somewhat differently from what the noble Lord expected. It has been a rich, encouraging debate, and I'm not sure the noble Lord Frost, however, has been watching the same debate as the rest of us. We've not been seeing a crumbling, but rather a strengthening of the wall of understanding and common sense, particularly, I will say, among the majority opposition party on this side of the House. I also want to join many others in welcoming the Lady Baroness May of Maidenhead to your Lordship's house, and to publicly offer the thanks for, in her notably restrained, as the noble Lord Young noted, resignation list, offering the Green Party the seat that came to bring me into your Lordship's house. I hope she might encourage further moves in that direction from her new position in your Lordship's house. Now, the noble Lord Lilley, in introducing this, said he wanted an honest and informed debate. So I want to start by picking up a couple of the terms that the noble Lord Lilley used. Cheap energy. Well, fossil fuel energy, as a number of noble lords have already outlined, as the noble Lord Willits identified, has very, very considerable externalised costs. In fact, burning fossil fuels, is costing us the earth. Now, as the noble Lord Davies of Brixton highlighted, looking at the risk of the ending of AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, often referred to by a part of it in terms of the Gulf Stream, giving Britain the climate of Scandinavia would be a very considerable cost and could not be called a result of cheap energy. I would also pick up the point about the noble Lord Lilley referred to the drop in territorial emissions in the UK. But of course, as the Committee on Climate Change has highlighted, we should be counting our consumption emissions. And when we look at those figures, those emissions are only 19% lower in 2021 than they were in 2001. They are the goods, the services we are using that we are responsible for the emissions associated with. Now, like the noble Lord Young of Cookham, I think the criteria that the noble Lord has used to judge climate change action is interesting. Jobs, growth and prosperity. Now, I'm going to focus on each one of those briefly. Growth, first of all. This is where I'm going to differ from most of the speakers thus far. We cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. We are, whether we like it or not, in a post-growth world. And it's not just me saying that. I'd point to the fact that the IMF has just been saying in the last week that we cannot have expectations of growth in the future like we've had in the past. The pie of our economy cannot get bigger. What we have to do is stop forcing some people to rely on crumbs and slice that pie up fairly. Who is benefiting from growth in an economy where, in the UK now, where 4.3 million children are growing up in poverty? Now, the second point is jobs, and everyone's saying we need to create jobs. Well, I'd remind the House this week that just one debate we were looking at the new funded childcare places. We need 36,000 more workers to provide those childcare places. We are short 50,000 nurses, 100,000 care workers. Look at the immigration shortage list. Chemical and biological scientists, bricklayers, stonemasons, tilers and retrofitters. These are the activities of the economy that we desperately need. And what we need to do is stop having jobs that trash our climate, that trash our environment, and ensure that in a just transition, those skills, the energy and time and talents of those workers goes towards doing what we actually need to be done. That is a just transition. And finally, I want to focus on prosperity. One dictionary definition, the condition of being successful or thriving. Well, we are a society in poor and declining health, and what the Noble Lord identified as cheap energy is a significant contributor to that ill health. Air pollution. To look at recent mapping from the Expanse project at the University of Utrecht. There's only a few areas in the north of Scotland that have pollution levels at or below World Health Organisation recommended levels. Those levels of air pollution are contributing to heart and lung disease, COPD, lung cancer, dementia, lower birth rate babies, asthma. We are not a prosperous society, we are an ill society, and the burning of fossil fuels is a significant contributor to that. Climate action is also action to improve the health in our society. And the Noble Lord, Lord Frost, questioned the insulating of homes. Well, having a warm, comfortable, affordable to heat home, a healthy home, is surely a foundation of life that our economy should be providing to every single person. And let's not forget the cleanest, greenest, cheapest energy you can possibly have is the energy that you don't need to use. And also briefly mentioning childhood obesity, poor diets, our broken food system based on fossil fuels. Our 5-year-olds now are shorter than they were a few years ago. The economy is not working for our people. It's not working in its own terms. So we cannot afford not to have a climate agenda, one that needs to be far more bold and effective than what we have now. We should be looking for zero carbon by the early 2030s. That because of the climate emergency and the nature crisis, the planetary boundaries are exceeding, but also for health and well-being, the prosperity of our nation. We need to ensure that we have well-paid, secure jobs in every role that actually needs doing. We need a climate agenda, a just transition for a society living within the physical limits of this planet. Now, there's been a lot of talk and will be a lot of talk about technological innovation. And of course we need that, but we also need social innovation. Things like a 4-day working week as standard with no loss of pay, universal basic income, free education. These are the social innovations we need for climate action and for a prosperous society.
My Lords, I welcome this debate and I congratulate my noble friend Lord Lilley for initiating it. May I also welcome my noble friend Baroness May of Maidenhead to these benches and warmly congratulate her on her formidable maiden speech. We entered Parliament together in the other place in 1997 and I served under her leadership on the shadow team for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, so I can vouch that she is well versed in these issues before us today. I personally accept that climate change is real and that we are subject, as we've heard this morning, to increasing extreme weather events. I would argue, as my noble friend Lord Ahmed has, that we need a global approach to tackling it. And we need to find international solutions of not just one country acting on its own, but together with the EU, the US, and the BRICS countries who we saw meeting this week. Otherwise, progress will be slow, and we could serve potentially only to penalise our own industry and our own households. I welcome the reality check by then Prime Minister, my right honourable friend Rishi Sunak, who in September 2023 undertook a more pragmatic approach. I'd like to speak in particular to the impact of climate agenda on rural affairs. and I have to say it's not altogether a positive one. If I could take examples from the recent Climate Change Committee progress report to Parliament. Firstly, the end of production of any car other than an electric vehicle by 2020 will be extremely challenging in rural areas. There is simply a desert. There is a lack of charging points in rural areas. There is also a lack of range, and apparently we've gone from range anxiety to charge anxiety, or the reverse. But if the car can only go 200 miles maximum, that is without any heating, any radio, any windscreen wipers or air conditioning in the summer. So for rural dwellers, either in summer or winter, we'll be lucky if we can go 100, 150 miles maximum without having to charge again. Secondly, the commitment to renewable energy. Most often this is generated on land in the north of England or Scotland, or offshore and brought into coastal areas. Yet the energy which is created is transported across these rural and coastal areas, away from the very communities that could actually do with this electricity more than the national grid feeding into other areas, through ugly, intrusive pylons to feed the energy into the national grid. So I believe there is a very strong argument for ensuring that whether it's offshore wind or onshore wind, that the energy generated should go to serve those local communities where it is generated. That is mostly what happens in Denmark and other Scandinavian countries, and I believe that has meant that those rural communities are more inclined to support this type of rural energy going forward. I do fear that if the government persists with the plans to crisscross the country with even more lines of overhead line transmission through pylons, there will be a revolt in the country. And I refer to the area revolt, the rural England against overhead line transmission that was started by the Professor Carroll in North Yorkshire. And I believe that campaign may be dormant, but it will be revived if this persists. Thirdly, the recommendation to ramp up tree planting and peatland restoration. Both sound good ideas, but beware, it takes 200 years to create a peat bog. So I think realistically, while we can create the peat dams and that we did in the Slow the Flow project to prevent flooding in Pickering and North Yorkshire, that we can do modest achievements, but it does take 200 years to create a peat bog from scratch. Tree planting in inappropriate areas can actually be extremely damaging. It can create more floods rather than preventing them. Also, I firmly believe they should not be planted in the most fertile, productive farmland. As the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, set out this morning, farmers have a key role to play in tackling climate change and achieving net zero. They have recently, particularly over the last 18 months, been victims of the record rainfall taking large rafts of land out of production. My noble friend Baroness May referred to 2023 being the hottest year on record. The last 18 months have been the wettest year on record, particularly in England. In my view, the farmers have been the real victims of the recent record rainfall, taking large rafts of land out of production. In addition, they would like to become more self-sufficient in energy production, but as I understand, are currently prevented from doing so by existing planning rules. I believe those planning rules should be revisited to ensure that farmers can look to generate more, as other businesses are doing, of the own energy they need. The rural economy provides the food we eat, and farmers are the powerhouse of the rural communities. If we've learnt anything from the current invasion and hostilities in Ukraine, it is that we need to boost our self-sufficiency in food, not least in fruit and vegetables, where we are woeful. We are only 16% self-sufficient in fruit and vegetables, but we also need to boost our food security. Food security and energy security are complementary and should go hand in hand. I would conclude by saying the climate agenda should work for rural areas just as well as for urban ones, and that we should not undermine our food production jobs, growth and prosperity in rural communities, as currently the climate agenda can appear to do.
My Lords, I refer to my interests on the register. My remarks here are not about the expected extent of climate change, however fervently some may wish to introduce that topic into the debate. It is not the topic of this debate. But let me quickly address the claims made earlier by the noble Lord Davies of Brixton. I read that Scorpion report that he based his remarks on. He may wish to read it more carefully. The tale that the report refers to is not, as I took him to say, what is expected to happen in the end. It is rather the highly unlikely worst case. It's our old friend, the precautionary principle, rearing its ugly head again, and it's time we stop basing policy on the precautionary principle. My Lords, I welcome and congratulate the noble Baroness Lady May of Maidenhead on her making her maiden speech in this debate. Net zero was introduced in the waning days of her premiership, and since that bill was passed, 4 years and 4 more Prime Ministers later, there's been no impact assessment of that bill. How could that be? One might wonder to what degree the impact is seen as unimportant, because net zero is a religion rather than a logical decision. Let's hope that's not it. Microsoft and Amazon, of course, did their impact assessment, decided that renewables were for the birds, and are purchasing nuclear power stations instead. We need a critically evaluated choice in which net zero's impacts, particularly its cost, receive far closer consideration. As the noble Lord McKinley, who's not in his place this morning, has pointed out, in 2019, the Climate Change Committee estimated net zero's cost at £50 billion a year, more than was claimed earlier in this debate, and they quickly raised that to £70 billion. The OBR opined that the overall cost would be £1.4 trillion. Again, £56 billion a year from now until 2050, and that was 5 years ago. We know how undercosted government projects always are. Depending upon your assumptions, different estimates increase from that 1.4 trillion up to 8 or 9 trillion pounds. At those sorts of sums, exactitude is by the by. Such amounts will beggar the country, regardless. The Chancellor recently expressed alarm over a £20 billion black hole. Here we are talking of speculative expenditure going into the thousands of billions of pounds. You would expect us to have a pretty high level of certainty, therefore, that net zero was going to work. Do we? My Lords, not so much. Consider just a few of the many different ways in which our net zero plan could fail. If the speculative net zero carbon models proved over pessimistic, then the entire cost will have been wasted. Or if the rest of the world fails to follow us, and my Lords, let's face it, that's pretty much what's happening at the moment, then we beggar ourselves while making the merest pinprick in atmospheric carbon levels. Or if we overload our grid because we don't overcome the formidable technical challenges of bringing solar and wind power from source to point of need, then we'll have brownouts, blackouts, and a dangerously shrinking economy. Or if the controversially optimistic forecasts on the decline in cost of the mandated green products, on the decline in the cost of wind power, on the decline even in the number of windless days by 2050, if they fail to eventuate, then the cost of net zero dramatically and unaffordably escalates. Or, if God forbid, we end up in or near to a war, belatedly realizing that our lack of heavy industry, of steel, of hydrocarbon feedstocks imperils this nation, then net zero will be abandoned, although most likely too late for us to win that war. Or if there is a Europe-wide energy crisis, uncovering our folly in relying on the trio of first renewables, second one large, not yet working nuclear station, and third imported energy that due to the crisis suddenly becomes unavailable. Then calls for a proper energy security policy would quickly lead to us dumping net zero. Any one of these, my lords, could be enough to do for net zero, and yet several are already what the situation is, with others lurking in the background. Probability theory tells us, therefore, that 2050 net zero will in the end never come to pass, like some religiously motivated children's crusade. It will never arrive at its intended destination, but there will be plenty of misery along the road. Until such time as it's actually abandoned, net zero's exorbitant cost and its overweening regulation will frustrate much human happiness, crowd out many useful innovations, and, whatever ridiculous claims are made, lead to lower economic growth. Economic growth in our country is entirely possible, whatever is said. It comes from three things: leaner government, lower taxes, less regulation. Net zero is the opposite of each of those three. From the Financial Times to academia, the view is the same. Green jobs, talk of it, is nonsense. With net zero, the economy will grow more slowly, jobs will be fewer, innovation will be in so many ways frustrated, our nation will become less wealthy. To conclude, sooner or later, the net zero programme will come to be seen as having been a tragic cul-de-sac. The longer we take to conclude that, the worse it will be for our economy. We owe it to our country to end this misguided, ultimately catastrophic programme as soon as possible.
My Lords, I should start by congratulating my noble friend Lord Lilley on bringing forward this debate, and as he said, I think it's a very useful and important thing that we do have this debate. And because I don't want to be confrontational, I can say to my noble friend the other day, I actually agreed with him about Drax Power Station. We should work together on making sure that that particular sustainable, renewable is exposed properly.
Indeed, absolutely.
I should also declare my member's interest as a Director of Peers for the Planet and tendentiously in this debate as the chairman of the Human Trafficking Foundation, as my noble friend Lady May, Baroness May, has indicated. But I really wanted to congratulate my noble friend Baroness May on an excellent and inspirational speech. I have to warn her that she said that she was told that people in this chamber is different because they only speak when they know what they're talking about. I'm normally the exception to that rule, I have to say. I also have to say that this debate, in its good-natured chamber way, as we do here, as opposed to the other end, has been more confrontational than I've come across, I think, since I've been in this particular place. However, I would say to my noble friend, she was an excellent colleague. I came in a few months after her in the House of Commons and left a few years before she did. But I was also, she was my boss in number 10. And I was the Environment Special Advisor, which a couple of my noble friends here will probably not be pleased to hear. I helped get through the Net Zero Act. And there were other things that I think were a great success. The Environment Act, what we were doing on plastic, plastic reduction. And one of the reasons I mentioned the waste plastic is because the important thing there was to take the public with us. And by and large, we were. COVID interrupted that a little bit with the masks being thrown down and everything else and people not doing. But, and this is the important thing about this debate, I don't think I've heard anybody actually deny that there is a problem about the climate changing and the impact that's having on the world and all the various aspects we've had of it. I think the problem is actually down to how much do we want to contribute, or what is it doing for ourselves to not do it? It's actually inconvenient for us for a lot of these things. The things that my noble friend Lord Lilley has said, yes, it is inconvenient. I feel a little ashamed when my noble friend Lord Willits mentioned air travel, because I do enjoy travel, a bit of guilt on that. But one of the, I'll say advantages, one of the things that's happened as I've been around the world, as many honourable, noble peers will know, I have a great interest in conservation and biodiversity around the world. And I have seen the impact on biodiversity, on our natural world, in stark relief because of climate change. And I have seen, a few years ago, I was in Senegal, where our birds that come here to summer, winter and feed in Senegal and the Sahel. And it's almost a desert now. So no wonder why they're disappearing and the numbers are going down. So these are all things we have to consider. Now, it's the impact around the world. My noble friend Lord Ahmed made reference to this, the small islands that are going to disappear, the things that can be done. Do we sit back in this country and say, well, it's not going to affect us that much? It is affecting us. We've seen that in the weather, the rainfall, what it's doing for farmers and everything else. But do we sit back and say, well, you know, it's a bit inconvenient, and is it going to make a difference if we do something in this country? Well, it might not make that huge difference, except, as been said, it's giving an example to others around. And I would say that as we want to be in our own homes good neighbours and set a good example to other people, whether it's just down our road, down our street, down our town, whatever, I think that is what we've got to be doing in the world. We've got to show that we can back up what we believe in. So I think we've got to go out, and I would encourage my noble friends who don't see eye to eye on this. We want to have this debate because we want to get people to understand what they're letting themselves in for. I can tell my noble friends that my children are intensely worried about what's happening. And I'm worried about what world I'm leaving my children. So, as my noble friend Lord Deben said, that is what I think. If I'm going to stay on these benches, which I aim to, it's that sort of conservatism that I want to be part of.
My Lords, it's a pleasure to follow the noble Lord Randall, and to echo what he said. I think it's the first time that young people have been mentioned in the Chamber, and I think we all need to recognise where the public is on these issues, and where particularly people younger than ourselves, not just my children but my grandchildren, actually are about their future, because much of what we're debating today involves the potential damage and the potential prosperity, not of our generation, but of generations to come. My Lords, I declare my interest as Chair of Peers for the Planet, and I'm going to be disciplined and not follow many of the assertions that have been made in this debate with which I disagree. I'll try and argue my own case. But I do think, my Lords, it's a bit rich to be told that it is the side of the argument who recognises the existential challenge of climate change, as the noble Lord Young of Cookham, of the category in which that danger and that threat exists, to have it suggested that we are the ones who are subject to the fallacy that it'll all be all right on the night. We're the ones who actually recognise that something has to be done. And if you do accept the facts of the severity of climate change, it takes you on to the logic of looking at what needs to be done, of course, what it costs, Noble Lord Ridley is absolutely right. We're talking about big numbers here. We're not talking about nearly as big numbers as we'd be talking about if we don't do anything. And that's the point that was made by the Noble Lord Stern in his review 15 years ago. It was endorsed by the OBR, and there's a publication today from the University of Cambridge talking about exactly those issues. There is a cost to inaction, my lords, exactly as there is a cost to action. Much of the debate today has focused from those, I hate to say on the other side, but we are a divided house in some ways on this, has been on the idea that those of us who argue for action overestimate issues. We overestimate the dangers of climate change. If you overestimate the dangers of climate change, then you don't have to do so much. I simply would refer them to every single scientific climate academy in the world, to every meteorological organisation in the world, as to the seriousness of what we face, and particularly the proximity outlined recently by Professor Tim Lenton of the Earth's symptoms tipping points, such as the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet or the melting of the carbon-rich permafrosts. These are things that could cause irreversible change and accelerate some of the most damaging impacts far beyond those we have already seen. But we should recognise, my lords, that alongside those apocalyptic tipping points, there are also positive social and economic ones, and those we shouldn't underestimate either. To quote again Professor Lenton, tipping points in favour of renewable energy and EVs, for example, in some countries, not here because we haven't done it properly, are already underway that could help eliminate 37% of global emissions. And his wider work on tipping points suggests that the global economy could move rapidly towards zero emissions by triggering a cascade of tipping points for zero carbon solutions in sectors covering 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. As I say, the cost of delay is a serious one, and it's a cost also because rightly we have to look at this country's economic interests. The cost of delay also means a cost of falling behind our rivals, a cost of falling behind those countries that have recognised what the future is, of falling behind the states, of falling behind those countries that have set strategic industrial targets, who are seeing the benefits of that investment. For example, last year, clean energy represented 40% of China's growth. We talk about China as the bad guy on emissions, but China is actually absolutely at the head and the forefront in green production, and we shouldn't go behind that. And the last thing we shouldn't underestimate, my lords, is the power of government, both to unleash new economic opportunities by providing incentives and consistency of policy frameworks. My noble friend Lord Browne of Madingley said, to allow businesses to innovate and to succeed. Nor should we underestimate globally how influential we can be in this area. We may only contribute, as has been pointed out, to 1% of annual global emissions. But, my lords, a third of global emissions worldwide come from countries with less than 1% of the total. Half of global emissions come from countries with less than 3% of the total. So our contribution does matter numerically, and our leadership, our hard-won global standing across business, science and technology matters. My Lords, I'll conclude by saying that I've always believed that this country's contribution to fighting climate change will be measured not just in the quantity of the emissions we reduce, but mainly in the quality of the leadership that we provide. I hope this government will continue that leadership.
My Lords, I'm very grateful to my noble friend Lord Lilley for giving us the opportunity of this debate, and it's been a great privilege to listen to the maiden speech of my noble friend Baroness May of Maidenhead. I note that she had the prescience, having started her life in Eastbourne, where I live, at sea level, to move up to the hills in Maidenhead and to ensure that whatever happens with global warming, that she's okay. And I would say, one of the other advantages of this place is that we listen to people we disagree with. That very often we learn from that too. And I listened to the noble Lord Moynihan of Chelsea, and much of what he said I disagreed with. But I do agree with him on the precautionary principle. Precautionary principle and indeed actuaries have made a huge mess of our pension system and have resulted in a stock market with annual outflows rather than inflows, greatly weakening our economy. I very much hope this government will do something about that. When I was the Lord spokesman for Ministry of Agriculture and BSE hit, the first reaction of the precautionary principle people was, we must kill every cow in the country. And it was, my Lords, fortunately, we took wider considerations into account. So, my Lords, one does learn from people one finds oneself in opposition with. We're dealing with a science-based question here, and Science's Best is a retailer of truthful, beautiful, digestible stories based on clear metrics, evidence for what works, a real interest in getting at the gaps in the evidence, constant evaluation. My Lords, I think we're in much that position when it comes to climate change. There's a huge amount of work going into trying to understand how our climate works. It is a very public body of work. I personally would like to see more red teaming. I bristle when I hear about scientific consensus. Science is not about consensus. Science is about disagreement and challenging. But by and large, I think we've done a pretty good job on that. Where I think we have failed is on net zero. We have not produced the stories, the understanding, what my noble friend Lord Randall called taking the public with us. When we're in a position where even the national grid doesn't know what's expected of it in 5 years' time, we are not being open about what lies in front of us. We are not taking people with us. We need, if we're going to make the best possible, best coordinated decisions, to really understand where we think we're going to get our power from, what its characteristics and price and availability will be, because we're not dealing with little bits here, we're dealing with a whole system, we're dealing with a whole economy. We need to understand how all the bits will work together. And yes, this is not a story which will remain static. We're a long way away from 2050. We will, every year, how we think we're going to get there will change. But we need to be telling that story, and we need to be telling it openly. And I really hope that that is something which this government will set its mind to. To pick on three smaller, more particular issues, one of the characteristics of net zero is that carbon will become really valuable. We will not have access to the fossil sources that we have relied on. If we're to run a chemical industry or produce jet fuel or whatever, we're going to want to find carbon
where it is concentrated. And we really ought to be making an audit of where those carbon sources are, because a lot of what we now regard as waste will actually, in 25 years' time, be a really valuable resource. And we ought to be building the systems to make access to that resource possible. Secondly, nuclear clearly has some very good characteristics when it comes to powering those bits of the economy that need guaranteed continuous power. A data center is the obvious thing, which is why Google has gone down that direction. I really hope that the government will, as it is in housing, take a pair of shears to the regulations which grew up over decades of excessive anxiety about the safety of nuclear, and look at giving us sites, chasing multiple technologies for modular nuclear reactors, and dealing with idiocies like the prohibition on burning the nuclear waste at Sellafield. Why do we have to keep it when actually some varieties of modern nuclear reactor will use it as fuel? And thirdly, let us look generally at where the technological pinch points are. What are we finding difficult that ought to be possible because it's allowed by the basic laws of science, but we can't quite get there? Battery technology is an obvious example, but there are many others. We should be making sure we are putting money into research, because if we can get an early lead there, they will turn into big industries.
My Lords, I thank my noble friend Lord Lilley for bringing this debate forward. It is astounding that it has never been had until now in Parliament. My Lords, I refer the House to my interest in land in Norfolk as set out in the Register, and land upon which nearly every form of renewable energy other than wind has been developed. I started installing all these green forms of energy in the late 20th century, nearly 3 decades ago. I have loved the journey, and as a result, have a reasonable idea, from a practitioner's point of view, of what works. The first things were evacuated solar tubes for pre-warming water in shower blocks on our holiday park. Interestingly, they were the only source of renewable energy we have taken on that was not subsidised. We made the decision to install them on economic grounds. And indeed, on the Holcombe estate, we are on target, aiming for, but pretty confident that we will be net zero by 2035, and indeed carbon negative by 2040, thanks in large part to a large number of trees, hedgerows, regen ag, but all the things that we're trying to do for the right reasons to achieve that. I remember when the coalition government came in after the last Labour government had apologised that they'd spent all the money, David Cameron's coalition demanded every department look for savings. One such thing that happened was that the feed-in tariff for solar power halved. The next day, somewhat miraculously, the cost of solar panels halved too. Whilst I agree that it's necessary to kickstart all novel green energies, my example demonstrates that government isn't necessarily the most nimble of bodies to administrate them. Our new Labour government has made it clear to us that its commitment to make the United Kingdom's electricity supply carbon-free by 2030. Despite my overall support for the transition towards a carbonised future, I'm becoming increasingly concerned with the speed of implementation of these policies. To put it bluntly, in less than 3 months' time, it will be 2025. From that point onwards, the government will have 5 years to radically transform the entire energy supply sector of our economy to be completely carbon-free by 2030. Once again, I reiterate that I'm a supporter of the transition to a greener future. However, I'm also a realist. To believe that this transformation can occur in a mere 5 years without having a crippling impact on various facets of our economy is bordering on delusion. It is a fact that when renewables are used to replace fossil fuels, the price of electricity goes up. Examples of this can be seen across other developed economies. For instance, the German energy vendor policy, designed to phase out fossil fuels and nuclear energy supplies, drove up prices in Germany by 50% between 2006 and 2017. But Germany's phenomenal economic revival following the Second World War was based in the main on an unlimited supply of cheap energy, particularly cheap gas from Russia. Recently, Germany has invested more than any other country in wind and solar power, but the current government in the UK is convinced that we can do the same in a mere 5 years without similar kinds of economic effects. In California, the home of US renewable power supplies, progressive policies such as these have increased prices at a rate which is 5 times faster than the rest of the United States. I wonder if the government has considered such case studies when formulating their decarbonisation targets. Can our economy, which is already under significant strain, afford for such additional pressures within the next 5 years? I welcome the government's plan to increase wind and solar energy across the UK, but I'm very wary of what threats an over-reliance on these renewable energies could pose. As many members of this House understand, wind and solar power are intermittent. This means that the energy they can harness is dependent on the strength of the wind or the level of sunlight on any given day. For now, this is not an issue, as in the UK, along with other nations, we rest upon the safety of a base load of fossil fuel-powered electricity and nuclear. If the government implement their decarbonisation targets, this base load of gas energy may cease to exist. One could rebuff my concerns around wind and solar power's intermittent nature by claiming that there were ways to store excess electricity created when demand is less on very sunny or windy days. One of these methods is through pumped storage hydroelectricity, a mechanism which is already in place in use across 4 sites in the UK. Despite the efficiency of this energy storage system, it can only be installed in mountainous areas with reservoirs high up them. Thus, it cannot serve as a grand-scale solution to this issue. Another potential solution is, of course, batteries. This, in theory, would provide a low-carbon solution to fill in for the intermittency issues of those renewable energy sources. Once again, though, we have bad news. Researchers from MIT have shown that batteries to be used to replace fossil fuels as a baseload energy, battery storage costs would need to fall by 90%. I do not see how these changes can be feasible in such a short space of time. Perhaps the lack of alternatives to fossil fuels as a baseload is why executives of the National Grid have been warning of potential blackouts in the southeast of England by 2028. To shift away from this baseload of fossil fuels and gas while ensuring that there's enough energy to keep the country running will certainly require massive spending. If the government's decarbonisation targets are met by 2030, I'm sure that will come at an unbelievable financial cost. Does our economy have the capacity for such spending? I'm no economist, but I don't think we do, at least without pushing members of the public into deeper economic plight. Lastly, the government's policy of decarbonisation through deindustrialisation will have a direct, detrimental impact upon our economy. The recent closure of Ratcliffe-on-Soar just a month ago represented the closure of Britain's final coal-fired power station. Similarly, plans were announced to shut down the Port Talbot coke-fueled furnace, making 2,500 out of 4,000 workers unemployed at that steel-making plant. Actions such as these will no doubt be commonplace in the coming years if the government continues to impose their policy to achieve net zero by 2030. Let's be clear, these actions are not going to move the dial on global carbon reduction.
Yeah.
My Lords, I too am grateful to my noble friend Lord Lilley for securing this debate, and it seems to me the main impact of the government's climate agenda is to import pollution and export jobs, growth and prosperity, and the two are directly linked. To start with importing pollution, since 1990, our share of CO2 emissions embedded in imports has risen from just over 10% to nearly 50%. The very fact that we import half of our emissions should give us pause for thought, but unfortunately we're moving in the opposite direction, and the decision to cease all new oil and gas licenses can only mean in future we will need to import even more of them to make up for our own self-induced shortfalls. My Lords, whether we like it or not, fossil fuels are here to stay for the foreseeable future. Even the government's own assessment suggests that by 2040, the demand for natural gas will only decrease by 4%. And this simply means that any domestic reduction in emissions will only be made possible by offshoring the production and, of course, the jobs to other countries. Furthermore, the imported fuels will need to be liquefied, itself a polluting process, as well, of course, as the emission caused by shipping them here, and then further pollution processing it after it has landed here. So, while ministers may be able to stand up at international conferences and proudly proclaim our domestic emissions have reduced, these same policies have in fact only contributed to increasing global emissions. Now, one might say that as we produce only 1% of the world's emissions, it doesn't really matter, that the gesture is more important than the reality. But it's a mighty counterproductive gesture with a direct negative impact on our standard of living and quality of life. My Lords, turning now to jobs, growth and prosperity. As has been well publicised, the UK now has the highest industrial electricity prices in the developed world, directly caused by artificially penalising industrial and domestic consumers with subsidies for renewable energy, carbon pricing, and the extra infrastructure costs as a direct result of the policy. We have heard how the OBR suggests subsidies for renewables would add 12 billion to our bills for this year alone. And it will only get worse as we factor in future renewable subsidies and the 100 billion grid update needed for decarbonisation. My Lords, to give an indication of the wishful thinking involved by net zero advocates, in 2014, the current Secretary of State for Energy promised 1 million new green jobs. The outcome is somewhat less impressive. Since then, official government data shows an increased employment in the low-carbon sector of just 40,000. Against this must be offset manufacturing jobs we have already lost in other sectors. Moreover, there will surely be many more to come, not least in the steel and oil and gas sectors. So we now have the worst of all worlds, high taxes to pay for job losses. The other great beneficiary of all this wishful thinking, of course, is China. They are now the world leaders in two seemingly contradictory energy policies. Green energy, by securing the global supply and demand lines for lithium-ion batteries, solar panels and wind farm components, and brown energy by building the equivalent of 2 coal-powered power stations a week. But the Chinese do famously take a much longer-term view of events than we do. They would agree that due to recent advances in paleoclimate science, we know that over the last 400 million years, the Earth's climate is changing constantly and often dramatically, so that relatively speaking, we are now in one of its cooler periods, the late Cenozoic Ice Age, meaning that we are at the tail end of a 50 million year cooling period. On our own continent, even very recently, we can see climate change in action. In Roman times, it was far warmer than it is now, followed by a brutal cold period in the Dark Ages. Then came the medieval warm period, when there was even growing vines in Scotland. Most recently, followed by an especially cold period called the Little Ice Age, the coldest period in the last 10,000 years. The statement we heard today that 2023 is the hottest year on record is quite simply not true, far from it. My Lords, this long-term view of the Earth's climate changes puts the whole net zero delusion into a much greater perspective and suggests we are taxing and bankrupting ourselves domestically for absolutely minimal global benefit, if any. This whole world view of climate change should be the subject of another debate, and a very fruitful one it would be too.
I rise in the gap as I apologise to your lordships for having failed to get my name down in time. Can I start by declaring my interest and say I shall endeavour to be crisp. I believe that there are real challenges from climate change, and where one is facing a challenge, you have to do something about it. Now, my Lords,
For the last 6 years or so, I chaired a local enterprise partnership at the other end of England, and they were established in order to address problems and to do and catalyse things being done. We were a small organisation, we had a small budget and really pretty small capacity. Now, at about the time I took over as chair, there was a resurgence in general political awareness and interest in all the issues related to climate change. And needless to say, I and the rest of my board were bombarded by advice, ranging from eminent scientists through to cranks, mountebanks and chancellors. And sometimes it wasn't clear which was which. What should we do? We were an organisation to do things, not to talk about things. The opposite of really your Lordship's chamber today, I think, where we've had a lot of talk. Not that that's a bad thing, so you have to think before you act. But what should we do? And I advised the board, and they agreed, we should, within the general parameters of what was the relevant regulations, we should focus on, we thought, what was going to be most effective and bring the biggest bang for the buck we could. And we focused on business decarbonisation and clean energy generation. I said, don't worry too much what they think in Whitehall, we'll just get on and do it. And I believe that was the right approach, because you've got to have policies that work, and you've got to have policies that are not merely sensible in theory, but sensible in practice. Can I just, as an aside, suggest another look at the EPC regulations against such a background would be a good plan. Finally, as I said, I think it is important we all recognise that action is necessary, and it must be considered action. And as I thought about it, it struck me that perhaps the most effective response to climate change of all is one of the original, earliest ones. Because when Noah was told that the world was going to be flooded, he didn't sit and wait. He cut down gopher trees and built an ark and thereby saved the world.
My Lords, I declare my interest as Chief Executive of United Against Malnutrition and Hunger. Can I start by congratulating the Noble Lady Baroness May of Maidenhead on her excellent and moving maiden speech. I was Chief of Staff to the Deputy Prime Minister when the Noble Lady was the Home Secretary. It's fair to say that the DPM office and the Home Office didn't always agree on things, and in fact the Noble Lady was a cause of some suspicion of me amongst my fellow advisers, because one time I think we were all having a drink and somebody posed the question, who's your favourite Conservative Cabinet Minister? And to the consternation of many, I said the Noble Lady was. This was quite shocking to them. I think the Noble Lord Clark of Nottingham was generally the more favoured Conservative Cabinet Minister. But I said that because despite the policy differences we often had with the Home Office, I was always a great admirer. And it wasn't just because, like the Noble Lady, I am a child of a vicarage, but also because politics never appeared to her to be a game, like it did to some people. It always seemed that she was serious about government and its role in serving the public. And she never shied away from difficult problems and was always willing to confront and adapt to inconvenient truths. And I know I was not alone. My noble friend Baroness Featherstone, who was a junior minister in the Home Office, was also a huge admirer. So it is great to have the Noble Lady in this House. On this occasion we will agree, we may disagree in future. My Lords, the Noble Lord Lilley, who I congratulate on getting this debate, opened by saying how important it was to have an open and honest debate around the figures, and I agree with him entirely, and I think that one needs to be honest about the costs of net zero. But as the Noble Lady Baroness May, as Lord Deben, as Baroness Hayman, as many others also said, we've got to be honest about the costs of inaction as well. And the Noble Lord Lilley spoke about cheap energy, but he didn't talk anything about the actual cost of that carbon energy The external costs, which Lord Browne of Madingley and Lord Willets referred to. The noble Lord Davis of Brixton talked from his actuarial background of the scale of risk and how actually we're probably underestimating rather than overestimating it. And Lord Strathcarron just recently complained about carbon pricing as if carbon emissions don't have a cost. And they have a very severe cost. The noble Lord Ahmed and indeed again the noble Lady Baroness May referred to the small island states. The cost to them is utterly existential. Baroness May also talked about what happens when agriculture fails as a result of climate change, and she spoke movingly about how wide-ranging those impacts can be, including the impacts on modern slavery. And in the work that I do around malnutrition and hunger, we see how climate is driving hunger, is driving malnutrition, is driving conflict. Those are huge costs. They're costs not only to the people who are directly impacted, but they also have costs that will be coming home to us in terms of migration, etc. Concern Worldwide UK published earlier this week, or the end of last week, a report on climate impacts on nutrition. And it's not just that crops are failing, but also that climate heating is having an impact on their nutritional value as well. The noble Lord Moynihan spoke about a kind of series of misery that we were going to impose by acting in terms of net zero. Well, let me tell him, the noble Lord, this. 38 years ago, I worked in a rural school in Zimbabwe. I am still in touch with many of the pupils who I taught then, who are now somewhat older. And what they report is the impacts of climate, increased extreme weather events, drying rivers, unable to fill their fish ponds anymore. This is causing misery now. Misery to people which is replicated all across the world. And my lords, it's coming home to roost here as well, because rising temperatures and changes in precipitation patterns are altering vector breeding habits and pathogen development. The All-Party Parliamentary Group on Malaria and Neglected Tropical Diseases recently organised a visit to Ethiopia, which I was lucky to attend. We visited the Gelen Health Centre on the outskirts of Addis Ababa with the Global Fund. Now, Addis Ababa is high up, as many noble lords will know, and it traditionally is a non-malarial area. Well, at that health clinic on the outskirts of Addis, they were seeing the first evidence of transmission of malaria in that area as warming happens. And these mosquito-borne diseases are spreading with climate. Dengue has seen a 30-fold increase in the past 50 years. There's over 55 million cases globally, and transmission has started across Europe, with local transmission now in Spain, France, and Italy. When I recently visited southwest France, when I returned and went to give blood, and they asked me, have you been abroad? And I said, well, only to France. They said, where? And I told them, somewhere near Cognac. And they got out their maps. They said, I'm sorry, you can't give blood until after the quarantine period. This is now a tropical virus area. And it is expected that dengue will be transmitted locally in London by 2060. Think about the costs of those sort of things to our economy. The noble Lord Lilley said that India, China, Africa didn't give a damn what we did in regards to climate. That is absolutely untrue. I was recently in South Africa talking with the portfolio committee, the select committee on energy. It was at a point when we had been saying we were going to issue licenses on more oil and gas, and when we announced we were opening another coal mine. They were saying, why on earth are we going to do any of the things you're saying that we should do on net zero when you're doing this? Example is contagious. Nothing is more contagious, by example, and as the noble lady Baroness Hayman said in her excellent speech, the quality of the leadership that we show is really critical as well. There's also huge economic opportunities from leadership as well. The noble Lord, Lord Browne, spoke about our sustainable finance and green finance capability in the UK. We have a real opportunity to develop that. There are real opportunities in terms of energy efficiency in our homes, the savings that we could make for people on their household bills, and the jobs that could be created. And if you look at what happened to household energy between 2010 and 2020, household energy costs fell. Why? Because consumption fell. Why? Because the green levies were funding insulation and reductions in consumption. And as Lord Deben said, if we had continued with that, we would have made massive savings. Let me just conclude by saying this. Baroness Hayman said it was quite rich for those on this side of the argument to be accused of saying it'll be all right on the night. I fully agree with her. Lord Lilley, Lord Frost, Lord Moynihan and others like to pose as the hard-headed realists in the face of starry-eyed idealists like, I suppose, myself and others. But in fact, they're the fantasists. They're the people, because they don't like some of the things we will need to do, and some of them will be difficult. They pretend it doesn't exist. The noble Lord Frost says he doesn't believe in a climate emergency. He doesn't believe in it. Well, I'm afraid science does. And we need to act. And we need to act now because, as Lord Deben said, the longer we wait, the more it will cost.
My Lords, may I begin by thanking Lord Lilley for bringing this debate, and more particularly to welcome Baroness May of Maidenhead to her place in this House and congratulate her on a first-class and compelling maiden speech. Speaking on behalf of the front bench here, His Majesty's Opposition, I would begin actually by congratulating the government, applauding the government on their ambitions in this area, having read their document, the ambition to make Britain a clean energy superpower. And this is something which I think we could all agree on all sides of the House. I note that the energy mission is very specific and stated as being to cut bills, create jobs and deliver security with cheaper zero-carbon electricity by 2030, accelerating to net zero. This has already been highlighted by my noble friend Earl Lester, and I think that the practicality of this is an area which I'd like to explore this afternoon. If we just remind ourselves what we mean by net zero at 2050, we can say that roughly that today we power our economy 75% hydrocarbon, 25% renewable, and that our target by 2050 is to spin that on its head and make it 75% renewable and 25% hydrocarbon. We can all agree that that target is a good target. What we're talking about today is how we get there and at what cost. The first thing to say about net zero is that does not mean zero hydrocarbon. Hydrocarbon is a very important part of our energy supply. We still have high-intensity industries that we need to power in this country. We have days, as has been mentioned, where the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow. We have base load that we need to take care of. But we have an opportunity to make our hydrocarbon the greenest in the world. The science and technology that's being employed in the North Sea is extraordinary. There will be no flaring, there will be carbon capture, there will be the use of green hydrogen. The technology will allow us to be the greenest hydrocarbon fuels in the world, thereby not relying on bringing in dirty fuel from elsewhere. But we will surely end up with a balanced scorecard. Isn't that the point of this, that we'll have 75% non-hydrocarbon? Pick a number, whether it's 50% or 60% renewables, or whether it's 15 or 25% nuclear. But we will, if we do this correctly, have a balanced scorecard which is to the benefit of everybody. I think the philosophical question is, who are we to determine the mix? And should it be left to bottom-up market forces to determine, as technologies emerge, where the best solutions lie, or should it instead be imposed by top-down ideologies? My worry with the 2030 target from the government is that it is actually artificially unrealistic. And I worry that it's driven by ideology, driven by politics, rather than being practical. And if that is the case, what are the costs? Will this actually cost the British consumer on the journey that we all feel sure we will achieve in 2050? Why would I say the government's ambitions are perhaps unrealistic? Just taking leading analyst Cornwall Insights calculation, the renewables, principally being solar, onshore, offshore wind, will provide 44% of UK electricity by 2030, the date that the government has in mind. But that is actually, it requires 67% to actually fully decarbonise the electricity system. These are two quite different numbers. And Cornwall Insight calculate that it would cost an extra whopping 48 billion on top of the 18 billion already committed to achieve that target in 2030. My Lords, it will be the British taxpayers who will ultimately bear that cost through a combination of higher consumer bills and higher taxes. And so the first question I would pose to the Noble Lord the Minister is, has the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, and indeed the Treasury, completed any impact assessments on this timetable, on this 2030 target, including sensitivity analyses clearly taking account of energy pricing and capital cost volatility? Moving on to the question of energy transition, where again I think there is consensus in the House that we will go from 75-25 to 20, sorry, from 25 to 75 the other way around. The worry here is that we don't want to do this at the point of endangering jobs and prosperity. We need, if we just, for example, take the impact of the North Sea oil and gas sector. So this sector employs 220,000 people in the UK. These are highly technical and well-paid jobs. 93,000 of them are in Scotland. The windfall tax that was imposed, however reluctantly by the previous government, did at least have the merit of being temporary to 2025, and it could be justified to prevent short-term profiteering after the Ukraine war. But the current government's plans to increase that to 78% and extend it to 2029 will create a massive disincentive to investors in this sector, which still remains important to our economy and will be a barrier to growth in our economy. As one American investor said to me recently, we now consider West Africa to be a more stable and appealing investment environment than the UK. And then there's Labour's proposed ban on awarding any new North Sea oil and gas licences, which already spooked producers. For example, the 3 owners of the Buchan field, 120 miles offshore Aberdeen, have already delayed by a year their planned start to oil production until they get clarity on the government's intentions. Be aware that these gas licences are already in the pipeline. The approval on those have been given many years ago, and they're already baked into our net zero 2050 plan. They already are baked in to be the green hydrocarbon fields that will still allow us to have a quarter of our energy coming from that important source. So delays in this regard are not to the benefit of anyone, consumers or otherwise. And if we just look at the transition of the North Sea transition, how should it actually work in a practical way rather than an ideological way? The fact of the matter is the biggest investors in renewables in the North Sea are the hydrocarbon companies who are reinvesting their profits into renewables. They hold the two key components for an orderly transition to net zero from oil and gas to renewables. These two components are capital and people. I'll give you an example on capital. I had the privilege of sitting on the North Sea Transition Forum while I was a Scotland Office Minister, and one of the investors in the North Sea said that their target for capex in 2025 was going to be 50% in hydrocarbon, 50% in renewables, to get a blended return on capital of 12.5%. So being the private equity guy, I asked the question, what's your return on capital on renewables? After a short silence and a slight look at the floor, it emerges the return on capital is quite low. It's about 5%. So if you can do the math, if you're doing 50-50, you can work out return on capital on hydrocarbon is 20% to get your blended 12.5%. Now that is market economics, because wind and water on the face of it are relatively cheap to capture. Therefore, they are not expensive things to generate. Therefore, one has a lower return on capital, whereas hydrocarbon is more difficult, especially in the deeper fields in the North Sea. It requires a lot more expense, and therefore it's got a higher cost of capital. The point is that one is funding the other, and you cannot disconnect the two. And the second thing around people, I had, again, the privilege in that period of going off to the offshore wind farm in Kincardine, which is off Aberdeenshire, the biggest in the UK. Fun fact, if you're doing media that day, take them on the boat to Kincardine wind farm, because the journalist was so ill on the journey he couldn't ask me any questions. But this is the biggest offshore wind farm in the UK. And what is notable about the being in the sheer scale and size of these floating turbines is the technology and the engineering required to power them and maintain them. And it's exactly the same skills that have been developed in the deep sea offshore oil industry, which are now being deployed to create our offshore wind farms overseas. And that expertise is sought around the world. In the couple of trade missions I did to Chile and to Mozambique, two countries with very large coastlines, UK expertise is required to help the world understand how to do offshore wind farms. So the hydrocarbon companies have a key component of capital and people. If we accelerate a transition just for ideological purposes, just to say at conferences that we've set a target early by 5 years, and along the way we reduce the capital in the system and we make skilled people redundant, I'm afraid to say, my lords, that I believe that we will not get the transition that we all want. There will be no transition at all. It will certainly not be a just transition. It will result, I think, in needless job losses and project cost inflation, which will be to the great detriment of British consumers and taxpayers. Offshore Energies UK think that trajectory of shutting down the North Sea too early will result in 42,000 job losses. That's 25% of this critical and well-paid sector. So my second question for my noble Lord the Minister, again, is DESNZ and the Treasury done any impact assessment on this, on jobs and prosperity to come from this ideological cancellation or early acceleration of that in the North Sea transition? I think, my lords, the issue here, again, in terms of ideology versus being practical, is driven also by the idea of top-down targets imposed by governments. Is that the right thing that we should be doing? If we have a look at a couple of examples, you know, if we look at what's happening with electric vehicles at the moment, we've actually managed to reduce... One way over. In which case, I'll leave that there. Let me just finish in conclusion that my worry is that we need to be more practical in how we do the transition, and that we also need to allow technologies to emerge. These will provide the answer to the question we're facing. We do not wish to become like a telecoms company in the 90s, installing infrastructure for phone boxes, landlines and fax machines. We need to be savvy and technologically aware.
Well, my lords, I'm very grateful to the noble Lord Lilley for instituting what I think has been a very, very interesting debate, and to all noble lords who have spoken in it. And may I first welcome the noble Lord Offord to, I think, his first speaking outing in his new position. I would also actually like to thank him for his service as a minister and readily acknowledge that on the horizon sub-postmasters and mistresses issue, I thought he was very fair in the information and responses he gave to the House. I, of course, would also like to congratulate the noble Baroness Lady May on what I can only describe as a truly excellent maiden speech. Also for her insights into the threats that climate change can bring, the risk to vulnerable people, and of course her record in relation to modern slavery. In our debates on these issues over the last few years, this has been very much recognised. Finally, I want to echo the noble Lord Young, that her sensitivity to the House of Lords when it came to the question of balance of membership and appointments was very much regarded around the House. Now, my Lords, I think that we have had a really interesting debate and that we have heard again from Lord Lilley. He really extended the argument that he started in our King's Speech debate. And essentially, he accepts the science of global warming, as he said at King's Speech, is rock solid. He is sceptical that tackling climate change and accelerating the move to net zero will lower energy bills and generate economic growth. I think he'd I've got his argument, my lords, but I think he'd recognise that he had a mixed response even from his own benches. And I certainly warmed to Lord Randall, Lord Willits, Lord Ahmed, and the contribution of Lord Deben as a former chair of the Climate Change Committee, who really, I think, put the case for urgent action. It is, though, noticeable that the noble Lords, Lord Moynham, Lord Frost, Lord Strathcarron, and to a certain extent the Earl of Leicester, came in firmly behind Lord Lilley, and Lord Offord, while praising our ambitions, posed challenges over the 2030 target. And I do sense, as the noble Lord Frost suggested, that maybe some of the political consensus on net zero is breaking down. I think that would be a great pity. I think it would be a great pity if the Conservative Party, under its new leadership, retreated on net zero, because I do believe, and I pick up the point raised about the need to take the public with us and tell the public a picture about where we're trying to get to on net zero. I think that if there were to be a lack of political consensus, it becomes much, much harder to get this over to the public, whose support we need for what are often going to be very challenging policies. And I don't think there's any point running away from that. And I would say, my lords, and I thought Lord Browne was absolutely right, you know, the last Prime Minister, by relaxing the electric vehicle target, it had a really damaging impact on the sector and public confidence. And my worry is, my lords, that the Conservative Party as a whole seem to be retreating from their ambitions. With due acknowledgement to Sir Augustine, the Conservatives seem to be saying, "Oh Lord, deliver us from climate change, but not just yet." So, my lords, as the noble Baroness Lady Hayman, whose leadership of Peers for the Planet I readily acknowledge and applaud, put it so well, the 2030 target is not a sort of notional political game. The fact is we can't afford to slow down. We have to speed up. And my lords, despite the noble Lord Frost's comments, the fact is that on climate change, we know human activity has already resulted in warming of around 1.3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We're seeing the impact already. This is no longer a theoretical construct for the future. It's happening now, it's happening here, it's happening globally. And as the noble Lord Oates said, in some developing countries, the impact is having a huge consequence on individual vulnerable people already. And my lords, I do think that the paper circulated by Peers for the Planet and Exeter University for this debate It quotes a number of people, but Professor Penny Endersby, Chief Exec of the Met Office, who should know a thing or two about it, said if we don't limit temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we would see many more weather and climate extremes, including loss of food, water, energy security, leading to increased global conflict. And of course, the other point that the Noble Lord Oates raised is that the spread of disease cannot be confined to those vulnerable developing countries. In the end, we will suffer the impact as well. Lord Ahmed's comment about the threat to small islands was very well taken. I noted his comment about climate finance and the need to support developing countries. I can confirm to him that we are steadily, resolutely committed to upholding previously agreed international commitments such as a global forest finance pledge. And of course, he will understand that we are approaching crucial discussions in Baku in the next COP meeting. My Lords, the Noble Lord Lilley was a mite critical of the Committee on Climate Change. And of course, I thought his noble friend answered that pretty robustly as well. But the government respects the work of the committee. We rely on the independence of the committee to provide us with robust advice, which I believe they have done. And I do think, my Lords, that in terms of the robustness of their research and evidence, I think it has been first rate. And my Lords, they're very clear. I mean, they were critical of the previous government because of the inconsistent messages they gave on net zero, the cancellations, the delays, the exemptions to certain practices undermine confidence. And they say to us that we are currently off track to hit the 2030 target of a 68% reduction in emissions compared to 1990 levels. The committee said we had to move fast. Action is needed across all sectors of the economy with low carbon technologies the norm. And I suppose, my Lords, that is one of my responses to the Noble Lord Off. That is why we have to move so quickly. My Lords, what have we done? Well, and the Noble Lord Young asked, how effective is the government's approach? And Baroness Hayman discussed the power of government. And in a sense, I suppose it answered the Noble Lord when he posed the question, a philosophical question, should this be bottom-up in a sense, or should this be led by the government? I mean, I think, my Lords, on climate change, the challenge is so tough that government really does have to take a lead. This is what we've done in the last few weeks. We've got rid of the ban on onshore wind. We've consented a number of large solar farms. We've launched DB Energy to leverage in private sector investment, reached a partnership deal between GP Energy and the Crown Estate in order to encourage yet more offshore wind development. My Lords, we have signalled our support, I say to the Noble Lord Lucas, we've signalled our support for nuclear power as the essential baseload of our electricity generation. We had a very successful auction round which delivered a record number of new clean energy projects. We've announced funding of carbon capture, utilisation and storage projects, which are very, very important in terms of the industrial processes for the future. We've set up an office for clean energy jobs because of this whole discussion about the skills agenda, and published an industrial strategy to support key growth-driven sectors, including clean energy. Unlike some members of the party opposite, we actually do believe in an industrial strategy, my Lords, and it's not a question of government so much as picking winners. It's actually trying to support as much as we can from the centre those sectors that clearly have great potential to grow and to export. So, my Lords, the central argument is investing in clean energy at speed and scale can help tackle the climate crisis. We can create good quality jobs, we can drive investment, we can protect bill payers in the long term, and crucially ensure energy security. On this question of why the UK should be taking the lead, well, my Lords, my answer is, well, why on earth not? And the Noble Lord, Lord Deben and Baroness Hayman were so right. We have a strong vested interest in the world achieving net zero as soon as possible. And, my lords, we can have a pivotal role in persuading other countries to follow our example. And, my lords, on the question of costs and economic growth, of course, my lords, Lord Moynihan, the Earl of Leicester, Lord Lilley really focused on this, and the Noble Lord Lilley referred to Dieter Helm's review for the government, the last government, which I've now had a look at least a summary of the report in the light of his King's Speech remarks. I mean, what is noticeable, my lords, is that actually the last government ducked it when it had the results of the review. They then conducted what they call a listening exercise, and we all know why governments do listening exercises, because they received a report they didn't like. As far as I know, my lords, the last government is still listening because it was never brought to a conclusion. And my lords, I suspect that means that this is not a simple area of cost comparisons. I know the Noble Lord Lilley is critical of the use of levelised costs as a way to get a fair comparison, and he said that too in his King's Speech debate. But it does attempt to compare costs of different generating technologies over different time scales, essentially over the lifetime of the generator. Now, my lords, as the Earl of Leicester asked, can we afford the transition to net zero? My lords, well, an assessment by the Office of Budget Responsibility in 2021 concluded, as Lord Deben surmised, the cost of failing to get climate change under control would be much larger than those of bringing emissions down to net zero. My lords, my noble friend Lord Davis was critical of a PQ that I sent to him yesterday on EMOC, and he is concerned that the risk assessment of the actuarial profession is not fully recognised. Baroness Bennett also referred to this. Can I just say to him that that answer came after very considered advice, but of course I'll take away his comments, and I take his point about actuaries, who, my lords, could doubt the importance of actuaries in terms of forecasting the future, though even they don't always get it right. My lords, there is the question, of course, of whether in our drive to net zero, we're basically impacting on our own industries, importing more from abroad. And of course, my lords, I do take that. But, my lords, and I accept that we will never be a leading manufacturer in all renewable technologies. However, we can assemble, and we are now assembling, many of those imports. So a lot of the value actually comes to British companies and to British workers. And secondly, my lords, we do have many opportunities to export our skills as well. I mean, for instance, the Noble Lord Browne referred to our world-leading R&D capability, which of course is capable of export in many ways too. And my lords, there are areas of technology where we do have a great opportunity to export. I cannot go into the details of the assessment by, for instance, Great British Nuclear of SMR, the small modular reactor technologies at the moment. But, my lords, British companies are involved in development, and it's just worth noting Rolls-Royce contract with Czechia to produce a fleet of nuclear reactors in that country. There are many other opportunities as well. Now, Lord Strathan talked about the issue of green jobs. And, my lords, the fact is we reckon that about 640,000 people are employed in green jobs in the UK. That's a rise of 20% even from 2020 to 2022, which I would have thought the party opposite actually would wish to acknowledge that it has happened under their stewardship. And, my lords, the fact is that if Lord Frost suggests that we want fewest highly productive jobs, I agree with him. But these jobs are often very high quality jobs in a growing sector, very well paid. And, my lords, we need surely to embrace that. And actually, one of the issues we face is that in many of those sectors, there may well now be a shortage of people coming forward. and we need to work very hard to make sure we do have enough people who can actually contribute in those sectors. I have responsibility for the nuclear industry in my department. We have a target. We need 40,000 more people in that sector by 2030. And looking at the National Nuclear Skills Council, they project by the 2040s it's well over 100,000 people. And that is a huge opportunity of really high quality, skilled jobs, can be at the apprentice level, the graduate level, or indeed PhD level. But it's an industry like many other of the low carbon industries which really has a future. Now, Noble Lord Alford and Lord Stratham were critical of our approach to oil and gas, and specifically to oil and gas production in the North Sea. My Lords, we will, of course, the North Sea oil and gas production will be with us for many years to come, and we are going to need oil and gas for many years to come. But, my Lords, the fact is, and the Noble Lord Alford knows, the UK continental, it's a very, what described as a super mature basin. It was reducing, I think, from 2000 on average. Its production has gone down by about 7 to 8% per year ever since. And my Lords, the key challenge for us is to maintain that field because of the strategic importance it has, but to allow it to transition as well as we change the energy structure. And of course, the people I totally agree with him about the people working there, the skills they have. And of course, he's right that many of them has transferred to the offshore wind sector. I believe that they can also transition to other skilled jobs as well. My Lords, I was asked a number of questions about the externality of carbon emissions. And of course, my Lords, I would just say the UK does price emissions in the UK emissions trading scheme. But I will perhaps write to Noble Lords with some of the details on that. My Lords, are we confident of private sector investment? The answer is yes. All the indicators we have is that many private sector companies want to invest in this new agenda. There were many other points raised as well. My Lords, on the question of the use of the Ark, Lord Inglewood, my Lords, I did ask my officials for quick advice, but answer came then none. Nuclear, I've already referred to Lord Lucas's point, and can I just say to him, the point he makes about data centres and advanced nuclear reactors, we've seen very recently in the US some exciting developments. It will be good to see similar developments here, and we clearly need a much more flexible siting policy to allow that to happen, and that's what we are actually working on it. And I've met a number of companies very interested in investing in AMRs linked either to data centres or industrial centres. They have told me they don't need any government money, but we will see, my Lords. On rural issues, the Right Reverend Bishop of St Albans and indeed Baroness Mackintosh made some very telling interventions. I take their point about farmers, food security and the need to embrace them in this agenda. When I was a DEFRA minister many years ago, we were working with the NFU on that very matter, and we clearly need to carry on doing that. My Lords, on electric vehicles, can I say, Lord Willits in particular, and the Noble Baroness Lady Mackintosh raised this. We did actually have a debate last week on electric vehicles, and the points that were raised there are being taken forward by the Department for Transport. And I think if you were to read Hansard, you'd see that the points you raised, rural issues in rural areas, the issue about the differential in charging, were very much picked up. My Lords, on Lady Mackintosh's concern, re the grid. Of course, my Lords, I understand the concerns. No one really likes grid pylons. But, my Lords, we have got to do something about the grid network. We have to invest in it. I take a point about local incentives. I recently went to Biggleswade Solar Farm in Bedfordshire, where each year the company makes a contribution to local community projects and to church, things like that, which goes down very well, and we are looking at that very issue. My Lords, in conclusion, I do think this has been an excellent debate. I do thank Lord Lilley for his willingness to raise what I think are sometimes challenging issues. We believe we are delivering on a manifesto commitment. We need decisive action both on climate change and energy security. We will have a very big positive impact on jobs and prosperity. My Lords, we must press on, and we will.
My Lords, I'm grateful to everybody who's made fantastic contributions to this excellent debate, and I have to say, I want to pay particular tribute to the government spokesman, Lord Hunt, who we just heard. I thought his response to the debate was one of the most fair-minded and constructive that I've heard to everybody and everything that was said, not least in fairly representing what I was trying to say, though I'm not accusing him of agreeing with me. I also want to congratulate my noble friend, Baroness May of Maidenhead, for an outstanding maiden speech. It was noteless, it was witty, it was compassionate. We're aware, obviously, of her other great legacy on modern slavery, and Lord Willets reminded of her concern for the just about managing in our own country, and she emphasised her concern for the poorest, who are the greatest victims of climate disasters, whether it's increasing or not. It doesn't matter to you when you're hit by a flood, whether it's more frequent than floods in the past. It's still a disaster. But the reason the poor are vulnerable is because they're poor. And the reason they're poor is that they don't have the access that makes us rich to cheap energy. And if we deprive them of access to cheap and affordable energy, they will remain poorer for longer. So I hope that even if we think this country we can afford excessively high energy costs, we don't try and impose it on the poor and slow down their growth. I next turn to thank Lord Deben, who offered my greatest support for what I had to say, since because he couldn't refute a word that he said, he chose to criticise things that I hadn't said. He criticised me for saying, allegedly, that we shouldn't make any contribution on this front. Actually, what I said was, I accept. We must be prepared to make our proportionate contribution. He went on to say that I'd said something in Cabinet under Mrs. Thatcher, which is simply untrue. I'll remind him of the exchange we once had in John Major's cabinet, which wasn't about this, but about statistics, when he was wrong. He didn't respond at all to the points about why he needed to take costly legal action to hide or to prevent publication of the analysis his committee had done on the cost of climate change avoidance in 2050. My general view is that when people don't want to publish facts, it's because they think the facts are rather weak, and I assume that's why he didn't refer to them. Now, on the general issue of costs, with the exception of Lord Hunt, almost nobody who was enthusiastic for doing more and spending more, and generally goes around saying that we can do that in a costless fashion, commented on the costs I gave. None of them referred to the fact that we have the highest costs of electricity for our industry of any country. And one can only assume again, they're embarrassed by the facts. Likewise, when it came to new industries, apart from small nuclear, which I mentioned and have been advocating for a long time, and nobody mentioned what these detailed industries are going to generate new prosperity when we've doubled the amount of onshore wind, trebled the amount of offshore wind, and quadrupled the amount of solar or whatever it is, when that hasn't happened so far. Now, there are a couple of, I think, important arguments which is important for me to address because they actually go to the heart of the issue. One is the issue of external costs, which was raised by the noble Baroness Bennett, I think, and Lord Willets and Lord Browne. Now, that is the logical response to what I'm putting forward, to say, yes, you've got to balance the costs of doing something against the damage that would be done if you don't, and the logical way to do that is a price carbon tax. If you take the estimates of the American government, for example, which says that the carbon tax should be of $51 a tonne, which is about equivalent to a megawatt hour, it doesn't make any difference to the fact that renewables would still be uneconomic in this country. Then came the most difficult issue, which people who take my position have to face up to, and that is the threat of existential crisis. If continuing doing nothing, I'm not proposing we're doing nothing, but if doing nothing were likely to result in the extinction of the human race or even the immiseration of the human race, then almost no cost would be too great to avoid it. I accept that. And so I put down a question some while ago to the government and said, do they know of any peer-reviewed science or science produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, whose job it is to consider the science, which forecasts that if we do nothing over the coming centuries, it will lead to the extinction of the human race or even its immiseration? They said no, there is no such peer-reviewed science. So those who invoke it are invoking something which is not peer-reviewed science. It doesn't mean necessarily it's wrong. I mean, some things can turn out to be right and haven't yet got through the peer review process. But let's not pretend that we're dealing with a threat scientists have declared to be existential. They have not. So we're left with the central core of the debate. Should we have an honest debate and discussion about the costs and benefits of pursuing the path of net zero? I'm glad to say the Church was on my side on that front, that we do want an honest debate. And we can only do that if the government and bodies like the CCC and bodies like the National Grid produce, and indeed the Royal Society, which has had the honesty and integrity to admit, or the author has, that his figures were anonymous. We can only have that debate if we have that information from those sources in an unbiased way rather than a campaigning way. And I'm grateful to everybody for contributing to the beginning of that debate for the first time in Parliament.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many are of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content. The contents have it.